Hey listeners, how are you all? Thank you so much for being our awesome members. There's a lot to come more. Sit tight, be comfy, put your headphones. Now let's begin. Part 1 of What if Naruto had ability to control corpses? What are you doing? I'm walking, a smooth male voice said, annoyance creeping into his tone. To where? There was a pause. To Konoha, he said, rolling his eyes upwards to try and see the large orange frog sitting on his head. Konoha, why are you going back there? I thought you. Why do you keep showing up, Gamakichi? The man interrupted. I haven't summoned you. He felt the frog's front flippers on his forehead as he shifted, so as to place his orange face upside down in his eyesight. I like the company, Gamakichi said flatly. The man snorted. He would hardly consider himself good company. He knew that the frog really popped up randomly because he thought he could use the company. Gamakichi was still in his eyesight, looking at him. And the man used his forefinger to gently push him back onto his head, a silent invitation to stay. Neither frog nor man said anything for the larger portion of the day, mainly because the man had begun to run, leaping from tree to tree, and the frog had to concentrate his energy to hold onto his head. The man's hair was completely covered by a ninja forehead protector, which had been turned into a bandana. And without hair for traction it was harder to hang on. The sun was dipping behind the horizon as he pulled to a sudden stop. Gamakichi would have flown from his head if he had been a normal frog. From his spot in a tree near the edge of the forest he could see the gates of Konoha, tall and proud and closed. With a sigh he leapt from the tree. Bright blue eyes looked upwards, trying to see the frog on his head. The orange amphibian got the hint. Call me if you need me, kid, the frog said, disappearing with a puff of smoke. He snorted at the word kid, thinking. The frog should have stopped using it 5 years ago when he reached the age of 20, then, with a shake of his head he moved towards the gate. The 2 guards stationed at the gate straightened as the stranger approached. They had never seen him before, and although he looked normal enough, in times such as these, with missing nin becoming more and more common, they had to be careful. There was nothing distinguishing about him. He wore deep navy blue pants, a shuriken holster on his right thigh. His shirt was the same color as his pants and was short-sleeved, revealing lightly muscled shoulders. His arms were wrapped from his biceps to the knuckles on his fingers. The bottom of his face was covered with a dark mask, very much like a Junin they knew, but, unlike him, this man's hair was completely covered by his hitayate, which, they realized with surprise, carried the symbol of the leaf. Can we help you? One of the guards, a Chunin, asked. I need to see the Hokage, the stranger stated, a deep voice coming from under his mask. Both guards were transfixed by his eyes, a shade of blue neither had ever seen. He raised an eyebrow at their staring. With a cough, the Chunin had spoken first pulled his attention away from his eyes. Is she expecting you? He asked. I doubt it, he answered. I'm sorry but, it's important. The Chunin hesitated. There was urgency in the man's voice that made him believe him. We'll have an Anbu escort you, the Chunin finally said, nodding at his comrade, who disappeared in a puff of smoke. We can't take any chances these days. The stranger nodded. I understand. Quote, as a Chunin approached him after appearing in a puff of smoke he looked up, not that the lower ninja could tell since he had his mask on. Sir, the Chunin said with a bow. There is a stranger at the gate wishing to speak with the Hokage. The Anbu captain didn't respond directly and the Chunin began to fidget, wondering if he had even heard him. Finally, he spoke. Did he say why? No, sir, but he claims it's important. We thought it would be best to have an Anbu escort him through the village. There was another pause before the captain spoke again, a twinge of annoyance in his voice. We cannot allow every man claiming he needs to speak to the Hokage into the tower. If it were important she would be expecting him, and she has mentioned nothing of it. Go back to your post and tell him no. This time it was the Chunin's turn to pause. Yes, sir, he finally said before disappearing. The Chunin these days weren't the brightest batch to ever grace Konoha, Sasuke thought. Before continuing his rounds, when the Chunin returned the sun had fully set and the first stars of the night had begun to twinkle. I'm sorry, but the Anbu captain has refused to let you see the Hokage. Quote, the stranger heaved a loud sigh. This is what I get for trying to do this the nice way instead of just sneaking in, he muttered. Both the Chunin tensed at his words. Okay then, the stranger said. Thanks for your help. The Chunin's eyes widened as the stranger crouched low and leapt high above them before disappearing over the gate. Uchiha-san. Asuke turned and saw the Chunin from earlier running towards him and rolled his eyes. He did enjoy the freedom his Anbu mask gave him. Uchiha-san, the man at the gate is in the village. What? Sasuke asked, his voice low. We informed him he could not enter and he leapt over the gate. Sasuke didn't wait for further elaboration. He quickly ran through the tower calling his Anbu to action and placing the building on full alert. After sending 2 Anbu to guard the Hokage, he made his way to the roof, watching his Anbu spread throughout the city, searching for the intruder. He didn't see anyone suspicious. Sharingan, he said, a quick seal going along with the word. If he hadn't been wearing his mask, anyone could have seen his normally deep gray eyes had turned blood red, 3 black dots around his pupils. There, Sasuke thought, watching a navy blue blur dash along the rooftops, heading towards the tower. He was fast, and Sasuke knew his Anbu would not be able to spot him, not without the help of the Sharingan. He began running towards the blur, leaping from roof to intercept him. Sasuke made it into his path, effectively blocking the man from continuing any further. The man stopped running. His momentum carried him and he slid along the cement roof in a crouch until he gained traction and stopped. The stranger stood, folding his arms across his chest. The Anbu in front of him was completely covered in a black robe. His hood was up and the robe billowed around him as the wind picked up. He almost laughed at the Anbu's mask, which was in the shape of a fox, small wooden ears sticking up. Didn't anyone ever tell you it's rude to stand in front of someone who's running? The man asked. Sasuke frowned, not that the intruder could see. There was a tone in his voice, he sounded almost amused. Didn't anyone ever tell you that it's rude to enter someplace you haven't been invited? He couldn't see the intruder's mouth, but the way his eyes crinkled, Sasuke thought he must have been grinning. He sucked in a breath when he caught sight of his eyes. A brilliant azure blue blinked at him. It was a shade he hadn't seen in years. Suddenly Sasuke hated this man. Oh. One person was allowed to have those color eyes and he was going to kill this man so he wouldn't have to look at them. As much as I'd love to play, the man said. I must be off. Sasuke tensed, dropping into a fighting stance as the man ran towards him. He wasn't prepared to see him leap over him, to the next roof, and continue running. Son of a, Sasuke said, twisting around and rushing after him. The man had made it into the tower before Sasuke caught up with him. How could he be so fast? Sasuke dove, catching the man around the waist. They fell forward, but the man was able to twist away from him and roll to his feet. Sasuke twisted in midair to land steadily. You're quick, the intruder said, sounding impressed. But I really don't have time for this. He dropped into a fighting stance. Let's get this over with. Those blue eyes were taunting him and rage Sasuke hadn't felt since Itachi was alive boiled within him. Sasuke flew towards him, fist raised in a punch. The man dodged, aiming a high kick at his chest that Sasuke blocked. Fists and legs flew at one another, but the 2 men were almost equally matched. What the man lacked in the Sharingan he made up for with speed. And Sasuke found he couldn't lay a hit on him any more than the other could on him. They leapt apart, breathing heavily. What do you want with the Hokage? Sasuke asked, watching him carefully. Information. She wouldn't tell you anything. The blue eyes rolled. Not information from her. For her. Sasuke frowned behind his mask, dropping his guard slightly. For her. Yes. Next time you should ask before trying to beat the shit out of me, Tem. All reason left him at that. No one can call me that, he growled in a dangerously low voice. The blue eyes widened as the Anbu suddenly began focusing his chakra to his left hand, so much that it began to glow blue and sounded as if birds had entered the hallway and started chirping. His last coherent thought as the chakra-laden fist slammed him through the wall was Sasuke. The Hokage and the 2 Anbu guarding her looked up in total surprise when a body crashed through the wall of her office. He slid along the floor, coming to a stop in front of her desk and out of her sight. Tsunade looked at the large hole in her wall to see her Anbu captain stride through, the remains of chakra still on his fist. All of those in the office were thankful he had his mask on. For the rage they could feel radiating from him made none of them eager to see the look on his face. Tsunade cleared her throat. "Is this the intruder?" she asked, unable to think of anything else to say. The Anbu captain nodded, but he suddenly tensed when the body in front of her desk, who should by all rights be unconscious for a few weeks, if not dead, began to move. The 4 people in the room watched in amazement as the navy blue-clad man stood shakily. "Chidori, overkill for calling you a bastard, don't you think?" Sasuke was extremely grateful for his mask, which hid the fact that he was gaping open-mouthed at the man who didn't seem to have a mark on him. He was so confused the fact that the man knew the name of his jutsu went completely unnoticed. He recovered himself. "Shall I try it again?" Sasuke growled, chakra gathering again. The man turned from him. "Tsunade Baba," he said quietly to the gaping woman behind her desk. "I need to speak with you." She stiffened at the name, and then quickly stood. "Uchiha, that's enough." The chakra immediately dissipated. "Hokage-sama?" Sasuke asked, confused. "The 2 of you, leave me," she said to the other Anbu. "Sasuke, find Jiraiya." Quote. The 3 Anbu obviously didn't understand, but they did as they were told. "What are you doing back, brat?" she asked when the Anbu were gone. Her voice was rough, but it was covering for some emotions the man couldn't decipher. He played along. "Don't growl at me like it's my fault," he said, crossing his arms. "I wasn't planning on coming back." "Tsunade, what's going on?" a gruff voice asked. Naruto looked over to the hole in the wall, watching as a tall sturdy man with long white hair steeped through. He had red lines running down his cheeks, looking like red tear streaks. "Hey, Ero Sennin," the man said with a wave. Jiraiya stopped mid-walk and looked confusedly between the masked man and Tsunade. The twisted expression on her face was enough to tell him that nickname was not just a coincidence. "What are you doing here?" he whispered, resisting the urge to go hug the man. It seemed that Tsunade was doing the same. "What a welcome," the blue-eyed man muttered. Sasuke came in from behind Jiraiya, moving over to the corner of the office and standing there quietly. Naruto couldn't see his face, but he could tell by the other man's posture that he was brooding. He smiled slightly under his mask. "Some things have been going on. I thought they should be brought to your attention. We're aware of the sudden amount of missing nins from all of the hidden villages. That's why you had such trouble getting to me," Tsunade said. "Does the fact that I did get to you tell you anything about your security?" Naruto said cheekily. Sasuke Str. aidened and was about to lunge at him when Tsunade held up a hand. Naruto continued. "Anyway, I'd have been severely concerned if you weren't aware of the situation. The question is, do you know where the missing nins are?" No one spoke. Akatsuki. Akatsuki was disbanded after the death of Itachi and the apprehension of 5 of the S-class nins, Sasuke said. As a key player in the entire affair he had witnessed the end of Akatsuki. "I know," Naruto said, pulling something from one of the pouches around his waist. It was a forehead protector. He tossed it onto Tsunade's desk and she picked it up to examine it. "I was attacked the other day by a shinobi wearing this. He's one of Konoha's recent missing nins." Tsunade handed the Hittite to Jiraiya, a grim expression on her face. Sasuke could see the long horizontal scratch through the leaf symbol. "Why did he attack you?" Jiraiya asked. "Actually there were about 4 of them. They approached me first. They're recruiting, that's W. Hi, there's the sudden excess of missing nins. When I refused, they attacked. You didn't want to." Tsunade seemed to stumble over her words. "Of course not," he said loudly. "Just because the fox is evil doesn't mean I am. It hasn't taken me over, Tsunade Baba." Sasuke stilled. In a flash he had pulled off his Anbu mask and had the other man pinned up against the wall by his neck. Reaching up he pulled down the other man's mask. His blue eyes had widened, but he didn't struggle, mainly because he could barely breathe. Sasuke inhaled sharply when he saw the whisker marks he hadn't seen for 10 years. "You," he hissed, hand tightening as red eyes bore into blue, "are supposed to be dead." He was so close Naruto could feel his breath on his face, which served to remind him about his own lack of air. "He will be if you don't let him breathe, Sasuke," Jiraiya said. Realizing how tight his grip had become, Sasuke quickly released him. Naruto coughed, glaring at him and rubbing his neck. So, Jiraiya said after Naruto regained his breath. Akatsuki sought you out again. They did before, no reason to assume they wouldn't this time around. How did they know you're alive? Tsunade asked. Well, since only you and Ero Sennin knew, and I don't believe you would have told anyone, my only guess would be that the man everyone believes killed me isn't quite as dead as we thought, and is correcting a few rumors. Orochimaru, Tsunade and Jiraiya said, the missing nin are on the move. They've been moving steadily through the fire country. If Orochimaru is leading them, I have no doubt they are on their way here. He glanced at Sasuke, who was glaring at the floor with clenched fists. Okay, Tsunade said a while later. None of this is to be repeated. We do not need a panic on our hands. I will inform the Junin. Sasuke, put your Anbu on full alert. Naruto pulled up his face mask and prepared to leave. Where are you going? Tsunade asked. Wherever the wind may take me. Naruto said. You can't leave Konoha. Tsunade told him. What? Naruto said angrily. I came back here to warn you, not to be taken prisoner. We're not taking you prisoner, Naruto, but if Orochimaru is coming to attack, we could use your help. Also, you have to understand, if you leave and Akatsuki gets their hands on you. Right, Naruto interrupted, his voice cold. I forgot what a powerful weapon I am. Sasuke noticed that despite his anger, the look in his eyes was hurt. Where am I going to stay? A box on the street. Tsunade paused. She hadn't given much thought to that. You can stay with me, Sasuke spoke up. And everyone turned to him in surprise. All of them knew Sasuke was not the most social of people. Good, Tsunade said, settling the matter. Naruto looked around the room. The beginnings of panic working in his chest. He didn't want to be here, he didn't want to stay. He knew they wouldn't let him leave easily. Sasuke and two Sannin were formidable opponents, and while he could probably outrun them, if they caught him, he wouldn't be afforded the courtesy of staying with Sasuke. He'd be thrown into a cell for who knew how long. With a defeated sigh he nodded. Perhaps he could slip away once he was at Sasuke's. They hadn't spoken the entire walk to Sasuke's. It was late at night and they ran into no one, something both men were thankful for. It was likely they wouldn't have been bothered, however, since Sasuke had managed to remain as unapproachable as ever, especially after becoming an Anbu. Only a few people still attempted to reach out to him, mainly Sakura. A few other shinobis they had been genin with, and, of course, Kakashi. Naruto looked around when they entered the gates of what he could only assume had been a lively community of Uchiha at one point. It was quiet and empty. And he felt sad, not only for the people who had once lived here, but also for the man walking beside him, who remained in this deserted little corner of Konoha alone. Naruto followed Sasuke into his house, being led through the living room and into the kitchen that was next to it. The house had a sterile, unused feeling to it. Naruto sat down at the kitchen table with a sigh, pulling his mask down. Sasuke had put his Anbu mask on before they left the tower, and now the fox face was turned towards Naruto. If you're going to stare at me, at least have the courtesy to do it without the mask, Naruto said. Not looking at the Anbu that stood across the room. There was a pause and Sasuke pulled the wooden mask from his face, setting it on the counter he was leaning against. Naruto placed his elbows on the table, his head hung as he massaged the back of his neck. Sasuke said nothing. How long have you been an Anbu? Naruto finally broke the silence. 5 years. Congratulations. Where have you been? Sasuke said roughly, surprising him. Blue eyes looked up, narrowed in thought. Sasuke crossed his arms, showing his impatience, but said nothing. I've been around, mostly in the fire country. Sasuke glared at him. Why didn't you come back? You let us believe you were dead. Naruto didn't answer right away, a guarded expression on his face. It was better that way, he said. What could possibly be important enough to let us think you were dead? Do you have any idea what people went through? Iruka, Sakura, Kakashi. He stopped abruptly, but Naruto knew what the next word would have been. Me. It's a long story, Sasuke. Black eyes flared in anger and Sasuke crossed the room in a flash, slamming his palms into the table in front of Naruto, who shrank back in surprise. That's not a good enough answer, Dobi, he hissed. Naruto's eyes widened then narrowed angrily as Sasuke's tone and insult got the desired rise out of him. Don't act like I owe you explanations, Tem. He spat out. You never thought twice about me back then, don't try to pretend we're friends now. Sasuke straightened, and for a brief moment Naruto thought he looked hurt. But his general expression of indifference returned so quickly that Naruto had to assume he'd imagined it. So what really happened? Sasuke asked, his voice calm once more. Obviously Orochimaru didn't kill you. Sasuke. Naruto said softly, staring at his hands. I can't talk about this. I don't want to think. I don't want to remember. I did what I had to do. Please, he whispered. Please just drop it. Sasuke didn't bother to try and hide the surprise on his face. Naruto wasn't looking at him anyway. As much as Naruto's words made him even more curious than before, his T1 in his broken voice stalled all questions Sasuke had. Naruto's personality seemed drained. He was quiet now, reflective. Nothing like the loud-mouthed Dobi he'd known as a teenager. Why had he changed? He didn't press further, but turned, pulling some things out of his barely used cupboards. Naruto didn't look up until a steaming bowl of ramen was placed in front of him. He stared up at Sasuke, confused. The other man sat down across from him, digging into his own bowl of ramen, not meeting Naruto's eyes. With a grin, Naruto picked up his chopsticks. Anyo saw, what about Neji? Sasuke sighed in annoyance. As they ate, Naruto had begun to ask him about his old friends and Sasuke had been updating him for the last hour on the lives of Iruka, Kakashi, Sakura, Jiraiya, Tsunade, Shikamaru, Hinata, and Lee. Thinking of all the others Naruto could ask about made Sasuke mentally groan. Dobi, aren't you tired or something? He asked, all the while inwardly pleased that he was acting more like the Naruto he knew. No, Naruto said flippantly, I usually only sleep for 3 or 4 hours near dawn. Sasuke furrowed his eyebrows. Noting his confusion, Naruto explained. Early morning, less likely to get attacked. Do you get attacked a lot? Sasuke asked. Occasionally, he said, more so since Akatsuki's revival. They come around once a week or so. I'm waiting for them to send someone stronger though. You would think they'd get that I'm not coming without being forced. Sasuke frowned but made no comment. If you're tired, Sasuke, don't let me keep you up. I'll go train or something. It was said extremely casually. Sasuke looked at him quickly. What? Naruto asked. Going to try and sneak off. Blue eyes widened. Naruto, I can't let you leave. Tsunade ordered it. What does that old hag know? Naruto asked angrily, standing from his seat. She doesn't want you caught by Akatsuki, Sasuke said, growing angry as well. She wants to protect you, you ungrateful idiot. She wants to protect the village, Naruto snapped. It's the fox she cares about, not Naruto. And she knows that it's better if I leave. Konoha is safer. What? Sasuke asked said, not understanding what the other man meant. Nothing, Naruto said, turning. I'm leaving. I didn't want to come back here and I sure as hell have no intention of staying. He stalked from the kitchen and towards the door. He stopped when Sasuke appeared in front of him, blocking his exit. Get out of my way, Sasuke, Naruto growled. I already told you, Dobi, I can't let you leave. I won't ask you again. Sasuke crossed his arms, unmoved. He was completely surprised when Naruto turned and sped towards the open window in his living room, leaping out. Dobi, he yelled, following. Naruto was fast, Sasuke knew. But Sasuke was by no means slow. With a quick seal his eyes were red and he could see Naruto, not far ahead, heading towards the forest that surrounded the training grounds. With a leap he was on the rooftops trailing the navy blue blur in front of him. They made it from the rooftops to trees and with a burst of speed Sasuke caught up to the other man, grabbing the back of his shirt and yanking him back onto the tree limb before he could continue. With a surprised, oof, Naruto landed next to Sasuke. They glared at one another until Sasuke finally said, "You've gotten fast. Cut the crap, Sasuke," Naruto said. "I want to get out of here before dawn. I guess we'd better get started then," Sasuke said, dropping into his fighting stance. "I don't want to fight you," Naruto said. "Afraid?" Sasuke asked, smirking. Not of you. For you. Confident aren't we? Sasuke asked. Some things never change, Naruto said, blue eyes twinkling for a moment, the only part of Naruto's face Sasuke could see since the man had pulled him mask back up. He dropped into his own stance. Okay, Anbu Captain, let's go. They started quickly, flying at one another. Both were fast. Sasuke aimed a punch at Naruto's jaw and Naruto ducked, using his momentum to swing around, attempting to kick the Anbu's legs out from under him. Sasuke's Sharingan allowed him to dodge and he leapt to another tray. Elim in surprise as Naruto had pulled out several shuriken and sent them into the spot he had been standing on. Nothing would be accomplished fighting close range, Sasuke knew. They'd both continue blocking and dodging. Their fight earlier in the night had proved that. In that case, Sasuke muttered. His fingers flew into familiar seals. Gukaku no Jutsu. With a deep inhalation he sent a ba LL of flame at the other man and with wide eyes watched as Naruto didn't dodge. The fireball hit him full on and Sasuke watched anxiously as the smoke cleared, fearing he had hurt Naruto. He wanted to stop him, not kill him. He'd never expected Naruto not to dodge. As the smoke cleared, Naruto's figure became visible, still in his crouched position, head down and not looking at him. He stood, folding his arms over his chest. When Naruto met his gaze, Sasuke almost gasped. The red eyes of the Kyuubi were staring at him, but as he watched they slowly receded to the brilliant blue Sasuke knew. Naruto laughed. Come on, Sasuke. Is that all you've got? Your eyes? Sasuke said. Naruto winked at him. Are we done yet? I'd like to get going. You're not leaving, Sasuke yelled. Naruto's eyes widened in surprise at the normally stoic boy's outburst. You can't do this. You can't come back after 10 years of being dead. And leave again. Sasuke. I won't let you leave again, Sasuke said. When I left you came after me. I almost killed you, but for some reason, even when I was beyond hope, you believed in me. I've spent the past 10 years knowing that your death was my fault, that my decisions killed you. Now you're alive and I refuse to let you disappear again. Naruto looked away from him, and Sasuke couldn't tell if he'd gotten through to him or not. He nearly started in surprise the blue eyes turned on him suddenly, glaring coldly. How selfish, he said. I don't want to be here. Why don't you understand that? I can't stay here. It's too dangerous. Besides, no one wants me here. I saw my funeral, I saw who went. More importantly, I saw who didn't. 3/4 of the village, Sasuke. 3/4 of the village celebrated my death. Even with the mask on, Sasuke could see the sneer on his face. In Konoha, I'm Kyuubi. I'm a monster. A weapon to be used until I'm deemed too dangerous and sent on my merry way. He had to get Sasuke to let him leave, and if this was the only way, then so be it. I hate this village and everyone in it. Including you. It was quiet for a long time before Sasuke finally spoke. So why did you come back to warn us? If you hate us so much, why not just leave us to our destruction? Naruto looked conflicted for a moment before settling on angry. He leapt at Sasuke and they resumed their dance of blocking and dodging. I don't know what you are to the village. Sasuke grunted as they fought. But to me, you're Naruto. My loud, blonde, Dobi. If Naruto heard him, he didn't respond, continuing his assault. It was only Sasuke saw tears in his blue eyes. Did he realize Naruto had indeed heard his words? The tears distracted him, and Naruto finally managed to land a powerful punch, sending the Anbu flying off the branch and slamming his head painfully hard into the trunk of the tree behind him, before falling heavily to the ground, unconscious. Naruto stood on the limb in surprise. He wiped his eyes and jumped down from the tree, landing in a crouch next to Sasuke. His dark hair was splayed about the grass, contrasting with his pale skin. His breathing was wheezy. It sounded like perhaps he'd broken a rib. Naruto stood, turning his back on Sasuke and preparing to leap off into the trees. By the time Sasuke woke, he would have put enough distance between him and Konoha that he wouldn't be found. I was hit with the Naruto plot bunny and it turned into the Naruto plot elephant. This is going to be another one of those long ones, I can tell already. There may be possible Sasuke, Naruto later on, Who knows? The characters write themselves. Disclaimer. If I owned Naruto, Kakashi would wear much less clothing and do things naughtier than read Ika Paradise. Since he's usually fully covered up, you can assume Naruto isn't mine. Of spars and meetings, Sasuke awoke with a groan. Sunlight cut into his eyes like a knife the minute he'd opened them, and the headache he'd had upon waking intensified. His whole body hurt, his head and chest especially. He confusedly looked around his room, wondering how he got into his bed. He shot up into a sitting position, remembering the fight. Naruto obviously had won. Naruto. He had to catch up to him, try and get him back. Ignoring his pain, he tossed the covers aside, jumping out of bed. He hurriedly pulled his pants on and grabbed his shirt, running into the hallway. He never even saw the other person in front of him before he crashed into him, sending them both flying to the ground in a heap. It took Sasuke a moment to do anything. Pain in his ribs became mind-shattering at the collision. Taking deep breaths, he finally lifted his head from the other man's chest. His dark eyes widened as he looked into blue eyes and a whiskered face. The blonde locks Sasuke knew he had were still under his Hitai. Naruto. Sasuke, with those special eyes of yours you would think you'd be able to look where you're going in your own house, Naruto said, raising his eyebrows in amusement. I thought you were. I was. Naruto looked to the side, suddenly finding the bottom of the wall to be extremely interesting. But I couldn't just leave you unconscious in the forest. He turned back to Sasuke, whose face remained hovering over him, and smiled timidly. They stared at one another, Sasuke's upper body rising and falling as Naruto breathed. It was then Sasuke realized their close proximity and, flushing, he quickly removed himself. As soon as he sat up he hissed, his ribs protesting painfully at the movement. You shouldn't jar yourself like that, Naruto chastised, sitting up as well. He stood before leaning over and helping Sasuke to his feet. The dark-haired man draped an arm over his abdomen, and it was then he nodded. The bandages that had been wrapped around his torso. He looked questioningly at Naruto, who didn't meet his gaze as he helped Sasuke back to his room. When Sasuke was sitting on the edge of his bed, Naruto finally spoke. Listen, I'm Sasuke-kun, a voice called out. Sasuke turned to see his former sensei crouching on his windowsill. His silver hair flew about as haphazardly as always and his one visible lazy eye was trained on him. Turning back to Naruto he noticed the other man had somehow managed to pull up his mask, effectively hiding most of his face and the whiskers that would give him away. Sasuke sighed. Any talk they were about to have was over. What, Kakashi? He said, impatiently. Kakashi seemed to be amused, but of course, one never could tell when the only visible part of the Junin's face was his right eye. Such disrespect for your elders, he said, shaking his head. Tsunade-sama sent me to get you. An emergency meeting has been called to discuss new information she's received. His eye moved over to Naruto, who was leaning casually against the wall with his arms crossed. Who's your houseguest? He asked. The quick glance Naruto shot him was enough for Sasuke to understand he didn't want his presence in Konoha known. A temporary visitor. The Hokage asked me to let him stay while he is in Konoha. Kakashi wasn't quite satisfied with that answer. He saw the bandages the Anbu had on, and his sharp eye hadn't missed the look the mysterious man had given Sasuke. Also, why would a visitor be wearing the Konoha Hitai? He decided to let it go for now, opting to say, welcome to Konoha. I like your mask. Arigato, the other replied with a slight bow. Yours is very nice as well. Sasuke rolled his eyes. Kakashi's attention returned to Sasuke, who stood rather jerkily. He was obviously in a bit of pain. I'll be there in a moment, he told the Junin, pulling on his shirt. There was an obvious note of dismissal in his tone. Kakashi nodded, hesitating. He wanted to know more about this houseguest and Sasuke's injury. However, as much as he was loath to admit it, Sasuke was his superior. Because he was the younger man's former sensei Kakashi old often get away with questioning him, but there were days his patience was not to be trifled with, and Kakashi could sense this was one of them. I'll inform the Hokage, he told Sasuke before appearing from the windowsill with one last glance at the masked man. When he was gone Naruto spoke, but he left his mask in place, Sasuke noted. He was certainly obedient, wasn't he? I outranked him, Sasuke said, slowly putting on his Anbu uniform. Naruto didn't speak again while Sasuke finished dressing. The dark-haired man turned to him suddenly, slipping on his black robes. Are you going to try and leave again? He asked, watching him unblinkingly. Naruto appeared thoughtful for a moment. I suppose I should at least wait until you heal so you won't kill yourself coming after me in an injured condition, he finally said. His eyes crinkling in what was unmistakably a grin. Sasuke looked at him in surprise. He hadn't expected Naruto to cave so quickly and he hadn't expected the other man would realize that if he tried to leave again Sasuke would follow. You'll stay, he finally said. For now, yes, only if you promise not to tell anyone else I'm here. Sasuke grunted in agreement, an action so like him Naruto nearly laughed. I better not come back to find an empty house. I'm not going anywhere, Sasuke, I promise. I don't take back my words, he said. That's my ninja way. Who's at Sasuke's house? Tsunade sighed, looking up at the Junin who'd just appeared in her office. She hadn't decided how to go about Naruto's return, but she and Jiraiya both agreed that the fewer people that knew the better. They knew Naruto would want to leave as soon as possible once this was over, and if everyone knew he was alive it would make it more than a little difficult for him. It was bad enough Sasuke knew. The young man had taken the news of Naruto's death extremely hard and they all knew he blamed himself. Now that he knew Naruto was alive, Tsunade wondered if he'd let him go easily. Who did Sasuke say was at his house? She asked carefully. If Kakashi didn't know, she certainly wasn't going to enlighten him. A temporary visitor. Yes, Tsunade said, going back to her paperwork. That's who he is. What's his name? He's got a Konoha Hitai-8. Should we know him? He's a temporary visitor, Kakashi. Just leave it at that. The Junin frowned, completely unsatisfied. There was a poof and Sasuke appeared, only recognizable by his fox Anbu mask. Sasuke. Tsunade nodded in acknowledgement. She looked around. Was he supposed to come? Sasuke asked. You left him alone, Tsunade said, standing quickly. He'll run. He's not going anywhere, Sasuke said firmly. How do you know? He gave me his word, Sasuke said. Tsunade stilled. A man's words should never be taken back. I won't take my words back. That is my ninja way. Fine, she said, taking her seat. Kakashi, although he remained silent, watched the exchange with great interest. Jiraiya walked into the office, ignoring the door and opting to use the hole Sasuke had made the night before. Tsunade, everyone's gathered for the meeting. Kakashi, having just appeared in her office, hadn't noticed the large gaping hole until then. What happened to your wall? Your former student and your crazy jutsu, Tsunade said, standing and walking to Jiraiya. Kakashi looked quickly at Sasuke, who stood with his arms crossed. His Anbu mask made him look anything but repentant. Sasuke had used Chidori last night. What was going on? Come on, Jiraiya said, stepping back through the hole. Sasuke moved to follow, saying nothing and grimacing behind his mask as his ribs ached. Hold on, Tsunade said, raising a hand. Sasuke, come here. The Anbu walked slowly to her. When he stood in front of her she frowned. Take off your robes. Jiraiya and Kakashi watched in confusion. Sasuke took off his robes, revealing the standard Anbu uniform, a silver-colored sleeveless shirt over two high-necked black one and black pants. Black arm protectors were pulled up to his biceps, leaving just enough of his arm exposed to show the Anbu tattoo. Sasuke didn't remove his mask. Lifting his shirts, Tsunade looked at the bandages. What happened? She asked, placing her hand lightly on his wrapped torso. We had a spar, was his answer. The hesitation wasn't missed by anyone in the room. Rough spar, Tsunade commented. He broke 2 of your ribs. Kakashi's eyebrow rose. So that man had injured Sasuke. Getting hurt was a rare occurrence for Sasuke since the emergence of the third wheel of his Sharingan. Tsunade and Jiraiya looked grim. Sasuke said nothing. Tsunade's hand began to glow and Sasuke could feel the warmth of her chakra. When the glow stopped, the pain was gone. After pulling his robes back on, Sasuke bowed. Arigato, Tsunade-sama. She nodded and they made their way out of the office, heading to the meeting. Kakashi followed, watching Sasuke, now more curious than ever. Naruto wondered what Sasuke did in his free time. His house was scarcely furnished, there was no TV to speak of, and the house was immaculate almost to the point that it felt unlived in, so it wasn't even like he could clean to pass the time. But Naruto knew Sasuke, at least, he had 10 years before, and it wasn't far-fetched to assume that all of his free time was spent training. Training was never a bad idea, Naruto concluded, and, after making sure his hair and face were covered, he made his way to the training grounds across rooftops. The only indication that he was moving was the faint breeze the villagers felt as he passed. He landed soundlessly on the grass at the training grounds, looking around. It wasn't much different from the years before. Yelling drew his attention to the far end of the field. "I will not let you have him, forehead girl." A blonde woman with her hair pulled into a high ponytail screamed. Ino wore the exact same thing she did when she was younger, but she had a chunin vest on. "Shut up, Ino pig, he'd never love you." Naruto nearly groaned. They were still fighting over Sasuke. Did they not get his complete lack of interest in anyone? Then again, he thought with a frown. It had been 10 years. Maybe Sasuke was interested in one of them. Or someone else. He knew nothing of the raven-haired man's life. Naruto almost fell over at the next words from the women. "Lee is mine, Ino pig." Sakura still looked the same. She'd grown her pink hair long again after Sasuke had left Konoha when they were 12, and it cascaded down to the small of her back now. Same as it had when they were 16. Her attire was different. She still wore a sleeveless dress, similar in style to her old one, but it was a deep navy blue and went well with the chunin vest she wore over top of it. He smiled at the sight of the vest, he was glad for her. But they were fighting over Lee. Ino paused at Sakura's words. "Lee, I don't want Lee, but I won't let you have Shikamaru." Naruto had to physically bite his lip to stop himself from laughing. "Shikamaru, why would I want that lazy Junin?" Ino sighed, twisting a strand of her hair from her long ponytail around a finger. "Sakura, this doesn't work when we're not fighting over the same guy." The strawberry-haired girl laughed. "You're right, let's just spar." Naruto watched the women fight. They used mostly taijutsu, but occasionally they would use basic techniques, replacements or clones. Sakura's skills had improved since he'd last seen her. She was excellent at using the clones and replacements to get in close to Ino and attack. Ino, however, had wonderful reaction time and managed to slash the pink-haired woman's arm with a kunai. Naruto was surprised they were getting so vicious. Leaping back, Sakura pulled out several shuriken and sent them flying at Ino, who dodged, but was taken by surprise when Sakura followed the throwing stars, coming at her with a kunai. Using her kunai to block, they remained clashed, struggling against one another. Finally Ino ducked, kicking her foot out and swiping Sakura's legs from under her. Sakura landed on her back with a loud thump. "That hurt, Ino pig," Sakura said from the ground. Naruto watched her sit up and place a glowing hand onto her slashed arm, healing it. So Tsunade must have continued with her training. Ino shrugged. "You're the one who wanted to work on your inside guard. Forehead girl." Yeah, let's try again," Sakura said, rolling her eyes and looking away. It was then her eyes fell on Naruto and she started in surprise. "Hello," she called, waving him over. Naruto thought about running away, but even he could see how suspicious a stranger running off would look. Shoving his hands into his pockets he walked over to the two women. "Hey," he said, nodding at them. Ino walked over and stood next to Sakura. Naruto raised an eyebrow as the blonde gave him a once-over. "Do you need the training grounds?" Sakura asked, staring into his brilliant blue eyes. They were so much like. "No, I was just going to work over there," he said, jabbing a thumb over his shoulder. "So you were being a hentai and watching two sweaty women fight it out?" Ino asked, grinning. "Ino," Sakura said, while Naruto spluttered. "Ignore her," she said to him. "I don't think I've seen you around before." "I'm just visiting for a bit," Naruto said. "But you have a Konoha Hitai-8, Ino pointed out. Naruto shrugged. "I travel a lot." Sakura and Ino exchanged glances but made no comment. "So do you want to spar with us?" Sakura asked. "Oh, no, What level are you?" Ino asked, noticing he had no vest to distinguish his skill level. Naruto paused. What level was he indeed? Well, technically, I'm a chunin. He wondered vaguely what had happened to his vest after he'd left. Perfect, Sakura said. We'll be evenly matched. No, I don't think. What's the matter? Ino asked. Afraid you'll be beaten by 2 girls. Naruto smiled. Much about him may have changed in the past 10 years, but his competitive nature had never completely diminished. All right, let's go. The women backed off and Naruto found himself between them. One could consider 2-on-1 unfair. But Naruto knew at this point he was definitely higher than the chunin level. Okay, Sakura, let's go, Ino said, raising her arms. One hand was fisted and pulled close to her for a guard. The other was open, her palm facing him. Right, Sakura said, dropping into her fighting stance. Naruto remained relaxed. You ladies done encouraging each other. He was standing sideways in order to keep them both in his line of vision. They both growled and ran towards him, remarkably similar. They seemed to be able to gauge one another's thoughts, for as Sakura aimed a punch for his face, Ino lowered herself to kick his legs out from under him. He blocked the punch with his left arm and leapt above Ino's legs. He flipped away, placing both women in front of him. They were both surprised. They'd expected to at least connect one hit. With an almost imperceptible nod to one another they went at him again, opting to attack with speed. They did outnumber him. He wouldn't be able to block everything they threw at him. They rushed him, using quick combos that he simply blocked, using one hand per woman. His speed and reflexes were amazing and Sakura had to duck and roll away when he freed himself from Ino's attack and decided to attack her. Using his distraction with Sakura to her advantage, Ino planted her right foot into the ground, spinning and aiming a devastating roundhouse kick to his abdomen. She and Sakura could only blink when he turned and caught her by the ankle, using her momentum to spin her and toss her away, into Sakura. They both hit the ground painfully. Groaning, Ino sat up, and Sakura pushed the blonde off her lap. He's too fast, Ino panted, rubbing her ankle. He might even be Sasuke-kun's speed. They looked over to the man, who was waiting for them to get up. He's not even winded, Ino said. Sakura nodded, wiping the sweat from her face, leaving a dirt smudge across her cheek. We need a way to slow him down, she said. Give up, he called to them. Leave it to me, Ino said with a grin, struggling to her feet. We'll need a distraction though. Sakura smiled. I'll see what I can do. Naruto watched them closely. It seemed they'd stopped underestimating him and had begun to plan something. Sakura suddenly ran at him, pulling out 2 kunai. Whoa, getting serious are we? He said. She leapt into the air, tossing 1 kunai at him. He jumped away, keeping his eyes on her as she flew over his head, ready to throw other kunai. He kept his back to Ino, for he didn't sense her coming closer. What he failed to notice was the blonde on her knees, her fingers ready in a seal. When Ino slumped forward and the man stilled, Sakura cheered. Landing gracefully on the grass, she pocketed her kunai and pulled out some rope. Now to tie the guy up. Something wasn't right. Ino watched as thousands of images, presumably the man's memories, blurred past her too fast for her to see. Abruptly, the colors stopped and she was left in darkness. What was going on? Why didn't she have control over his body? She was beginning to panic. She couldn't see anything, and without the use of the man's fingers she couldn't return to her body. Suddenly, a low breathing filled her hearing. She whirled around, heartbeat quickening. Who's there? There was a clicking noise, reminiscent to a cat's claws on tile as it prowled a kitchen. Her breaths were fast now. Are you afraid? A deep voice asked from the darkness. She trembled. The voice seemed to come from every direction at once. Who are you? She asked firmly, ignoring her shaking hands. Ino, a gentle voice said. She whipped around to see the man she was fighting. He was all she could see, everything else remained black. What's going on? She asked. You shouldn't be here, he said. As she watched, the darkness behind him began to glow and suddenly there were 2 huge fiery eyes behind them, their burning gaze directed at her. She backed away in fear, biting back a scream. Foolish girl, the first voice said. You can't possess the possessed. With that she felt a horrible jolt, and her consciousness flew back to her own body. Sakura looked at her in surprise. She was just moving to tie him up. Ino scrambled backwards, trying to distance herself from the man, who was shaking himself from a daze. "What are you?" she whispered. Sakura gaped at her, rope hanging loosely in her hands. The man's soft blue eyes met her frightened gaze, his expression unreadable under the mask. "Thanks for the spar," he finally said. "I need to get going." Ino and Sakura watched him walk away, before leaping into the trees and out of their sight. "What was that all about?" Sakura asked. "Stupid, stupid, stupid." Naruto berated himself, heading back to Sasuke's. How could I forget that crazy skill of Ino's? He didn't know who knew about Kyuubi. Maybe after his death, it had become common knowledge. If that was the case, it wouldn't take long for Ino to figure out who he was. Especially if she got Sakura's opinion. Alighting on Sasuke's roof, he leapt down and into an open living room window. Sasuke was pacing the living room. His robes were draped over the couch and his fox mask was tossed in the armchair next to it. "How was the meeting?" Naruto asked. Sasuke turned towards him, looking angry. Naruto stepped back towards the window, ready to make an escape if needed. "Where were you?" "I went training," Naruto responded. "I didn't know I was confined to the house." Sasuke seemed to calm down. "Sorry," he mumbled. "Sasuke, I told you, I'm not going anywhere yet." Sasuke nodded and began to walk towards the kitchen. "Sasuke," Naruto said, calling the other man's attention back to him. "Who from our generation knows that?" He wasn't sure how to phrase the question. "Kyuubi," he finally said. Sasuke frowned at him. "Only me and Shikamaru, as far as I know." Shikamaru. Sasuke had seen it enough times to put two and two together. But how would Shikamaru know? He was your commanding officer enough that it was information he needed to be aware of. Naruto nodded, thinking, so no one else knows. Not even Sakura. Sasuke shook his head. "We were forbidden to talk about it. Even after your death." "Why?" He watched Naruto suspiciously, trying to gauge what he was thinking. "No reason," Naruto said cheerfully. "Just wondering. Can we eat lunch?" He walked past Sasuke and into the kitchen. Sasuke stared after him, finally following him. Naruto was balancing on the back two legs of his chair when Sasuke walked into the kitchen. "You seem better," Naruto commented, watching him move with ease. "Tsunade," Sasuke grunted as an explanation. "Sasuke-kun." A familiar feminine voice rang through the house. "Shit," Naruto said, startled to hear her. He lost his balance and fell backwards, landing in a clatter on the floor. Sasuke rolled his eyes at Naruto before looking into the living room to see Sakura standing by the open window. Why did ninjas ignore the door? He needed to start locking his windows. "Sasuke-kun," Sakura said, seeing him. "There's a weird guy in the village," she said, walking towards him. "He's very suspicious and Ino says there's something in." There was a groan and Sakura paused, looking towards the floor where Naruto was pulling himself into a sitting position. She gasped. "You," she said. "What are you doing here? Are you trying to kill Sasuke?" Naruto stood and twisted his neck, cracking it with a loud pop. Both Sasuke and Sakura flinched. Righting the chair, he sat down, looking up at them. "Ca. Ching from Naruto's expression that he wasn't going to be much use in this conversation, Sasuke spoke up. "Sakura, he's staying with me for a while." What?" Sakura asked, dumbfounded. There was a pause. "Sasuke-kun, can I talk to you for a minute?" Sasuke looked at Naruto, who appeared to be feigning innocence under his mask. With a sigh he followed Sakura onto the living room. Naruto could hear them talking in low tones. A few minutes later he heard the sound of the door, and when Sasuke returned to the kitchen he was alone. "So that's why you wanted to know if anyone knew about Kyuubi?" Naruto shrugged. "You apparently scared the shit out of Ino," Sasuke told him. "Maybe next time she'll think twice about poking around in people's heads." "Naruto," Sasuke paused. "Last night, when you didn't dodge the Gukaku no Jutsu. What happened?" Naruto looked up. "What does it look like?" he asked, sounding genuinely curious. "What?" Sasuke asked. "When Kyuubi surfaces. I've never seen myself." "So it was Kyuubi. What brought him out?" "He's a fire fox," Naruto said with an air of the obvious. "Fire calls him out. I'll never need to dodge it, because fire is my element." "But," Sasuke said. If fire brings him out, wouldn't you want to dodge? To keep him in, he never comes out to stay in battle. But what if he tries to? He has. I don't let him, Naruto said. Besides, he knows if he tries to come out I'll fight him, and if that happens during battle it's likely I'll get killed. He shares my death, and is intelligent enough not to distract me in a battle. You have control over him? Sasuke asked. Naruto snorted, stretching his arms over his cloth-covered head. I would never be so bold as to claim I have control over Kyuubi. Especially. He stopped abruptly, closing his eyes. Especially what? Sasuke pressed. Naruto became still intense, not answering him. Sasuke wasn't even sure he had heard him. Naruto. Trying to prove a point. Naruto muttered, N.D. with a foreboding feeling in the pit of his stomach. Sasuke wondered if he was even talking to him. Naruto stood abruptly, knocking the chair away in the process. Sasuke felt a sudden burst of power from the other man. Naruto's hands clutched his head and he began to grind his teeth. Sasuke took a step towards him, but stopped as red chakra flared up, warning him to stay away. Sasuke watched wide-eyed as Naruto doubled over as if he'd been punched in the stomach and opened his eyes. The regularly sky-blue eyes were now a violent purple, flashing now and then between their normal color and a fiery red. Naruto, Sasuke said, stepping closer. Stay back, Naruto, or perhaps Kyuubi, cried. Sasuke did as he was told. Bastard fox, Naruto growled through clenched teeth. Go back where you belong. With a rush of air the red chakra was suddenly pulled inside Naruto, the force sending him flying forward into Sasuke. Sasuke was only able to catch the other man and use his body to soften the fall they were about to take. He landed with a thud on his back, arms around Naruto as they slid across the kitchen floor. For a moment they both lay still, Naruto panting quietly against Sasuke's chest. What was that? Sasuke finally asked, making no attempt to move. That, Naruto said, still struggling for breath. As the reason I've been pretending to be dead for 10 years. Of remembrances in Kyuubi, A.N. I suppose I should have warned of spoilers earlier but I forgot. This story will have spoilers up to 242 of the manga, so if you don't want to know I wouldn't read any further. If you want to read the manga first then come back, head over to narutofan.com, you can download all of the manga available translated into English for free. Either way, happy reading. 10 years earlier, Tsunade sadly ran her hand through the brilliant blonde locks of the 15-year-old boy lying still in his hospital bed. In the room next door lay another boy, who was being watched over by a pink-haired girl, whose expression was similar to Tsunade's as she ran her fingers through jet-black hair. 2 days ago the boys had finally come to clash after their only real fight 3 years before. Their first fight had ended in disaster, leaving the blonde injured and unconscious and the dark-haired boy missing Nin. For 3 years they trained and no one but their sensei, 2 of the 3 legendary Sannin, knew the extent of their powers. Konoha had been on alert for years, ever since Orochimaru's first attack on the village. Naruto and Jiraiya had returned to the village only a week before. Orochimaru's giant snakes invaded and sound ninjas attacked. The first reports of the attack came to Tsunade when she was in a meeting with Naruto, discussing his training. Genma had teleported into her office, a toothpick dangling precariously from his mouth as he explained that 2 of their gates had been broken through. She ordered him to tell the Chunin that their first priority was to get the villagers to safety and to have the Junin fend off those at the gates. Genma had only left moments before the Hokage Tower began to shake. Naruto, Tsunade had called as the building moved precariously. Her first instinct was to protect the boy. The 15-year-old moved from position in front of the desk, in a flash, grabbing her and leaping out of the window as the tower collapsed. Setting her to her feet they watched the tower fall, clouds of smoke rising as the rubble hit the ground. Tsunade, Naruto, Jiraiya called, running to their sides. They could hear the laugh before they could see the man. The coo that they would recognize anywhere. A giant snake slithered into view, tail wrapped around what used to be the base of the tower, the end flicking carelessly. 2 ninjas stood on its head. As the smoke cleared they could see them clearly. The taller of the 2 had white hair, although his face was still quite young. The glare of the sun off his glasses hid his eyes from view. But they all recognized Kabuto. The shorter figure laughed again. It's been a while, Jiraiya, Tsunade Naruto. It was Sasuke's face, Sasuke's body, but the gravely voice emanating from his lips, that was Orochimaru's voice. Naruto hung his head, clenching his fists. He was too late. Tsunade-sama, a voice called. 5 Anbu were suddenly between her and Orochimaru. Go, she said. I don't need your protection. Help the villagers. The Anbu hesitated before bowing quickly and heading into various parts of the village. Let's end this, Orochimaru. Jiraiya called. Yes, Orochimaru said. It's finally time. Tsunade tensed for battle. She'd been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Naruto, stay back, she said, cracking her knuckles. Not a chance in hell, Tsunade Baba, he growled. Naruto, you can't fight him, she cried. Tsunade, Jiraiya's rough voice cut in. Let him fight. Jiraiya, he could be killed. Tsunade, the white-haired man said angrily. He won't be fighting alone. She sighed. Be careful, Naruto. Don't worry, the blonde growled. Tsunade-sama, a smooth voice said. Kabuto stood in front of them, a good 20 feet away. While I would prefer to fight Naruto-kun, to repay him for our last meeting, Orochimaru-sama has requested that I fight you. Tsunade looked at Naruto, expecting him to say something very loud and very brash to Kabuto, and was surprised to see him standing with his arms crossed, watching him with an expression that bordered on disinterest. His 3 years of training had certainly calmed him down, she thought. I still owe you for our last fight, Tsunade said to him. Your cheap tricks with blood aren't going to work this time. She rushed at him, and their fight began. Well, Jiraiya, I guess it's our turn, Orochimaru said through Sasuke's mouth. Angrily, Jiraiya bit his thumb, drawing blood. Recognizing the seals he began to perform, Naruto placed a hand on the older man's arm. Ero Sennin, if you summon Gamma Bunta, half of the village will be destroyed before the fight is over. Coo, came the laugh from above them. Looks like the brat's lost some of his brashness over the years. Both Naruto and Jiraiya glared up at him. Orochimaru, Naruto cried, I swear I will kill you before the day is over. He laughed again. Not much smarter though, is he? Naruto and Jiraiya suddenly attacked. The boy leaping to a building and onto the snake's head while Jiraiya ran up the snake's body, using chakra to stick to the snake's scaly skin. Orochimaru attacked with his tongue, a sight that almost made Naruto sick as it flew from Sasuke's mouth. Naruto ignored the feeling and flipped away from the tongue, which moved in an arc towards Jiraiya. The wild-haired man dodged. He looked towards Sasuke's Orochimaru's bandaged arms. If he could just get in close. The tongue was too long to allow for close-range fighting. Naruto, he called. After 3 years of training together, the boy knew what he wanted and quickly executed. Kage Bushin no Jutsu. 50 Naruto suddenly surrounded Orochimaru, and with a loud battle cry in unison they all rushed him. Orochimaru laughed as he fought them off with his tongue. Still weak, he said, watching them poof into smoke. His eyes widened in surprise as one Naruto managed to dodge his tongue and get in close, a kunai in his hand. What? He said in surprise, as with a poof of smoke the orange-clad boy became Jiraiya. A henge, Orochimaru said. Raising the kunai, Jiraiya lunged at Orochimaru. Jiraiya's big mistake was assuming his arms were still useless. He looked in shock as Sasuke's face twisted into a manic grin. Orochimaru grabbed Jiraiya's wrist, stopping the kunai inches from his face. Still as stupid as ever, Jiraiya. Jiraiya tried to pull his arm away, but Orochimaru held him fast. With wide eyes Jiraiya watched as Orochimaru began concentrating his chakra to his left hand. Naruto knew that skill. Haku's face suddenly came to him. Do you have someone who is important to you? Ero Sennin, he cried, taking off as Orochimaru's fist flew forward. It happened so quickly no one reacted for a long moment. Sakura had been looking for a place that she would be most useful. She no longer had her genin team since Sasuke had run off and Naruto had been training. She herself had been training as well for the past 3 years under Tsunade-sama's guidance. Now she wanted to do what she could as a medical nin, although her skills were not as highly developed as Tsunade-sama's or Shizune's. leaping onto a roof to get a better view of the chaos. She attempted to see who was in most immediate need of help. She was not prepared for the sight before her. A loud scream of "Naruto" broke the silence that had descended over Jiraiya and Orochimaru. Sakura stood on the roof next to them, gaping open-mouthed and horrified. Sasuke was standing on the head of a giant snake, holding Jiraiya-san's wrist immobile with one hand. His other hand thrust through Naruto's right shoulder. Naruto coughed, blood spraying on Sasuke's white-wrapped arms. Sasuke seemed to recover from the surprise and started laughing. What was wrong with his voice? Jiraiya stared at the hand in front of him. The hand that had gone straight through Naruto's chest. The hand that was meant for him. Blood dripped from Orochimaru's fingers and down the orange jacket. Releasing Jiraiya's hand, Orochimaru braced his free hand on the boy's chest, unceremoniously pulling his fist out of him. Jiraiya caught Naruto as he crumpled. "Naruto!" Tsunade cried from the ground. She went to rush for him, but was blocked by Kabuto. "You're not done here, Tsunade-sama. Get out of my way!" She screamed, but was forced to dodge as he concentrated his chakra to his hands and lunged, trying to cut her muscles. "You okay, Ero-sennin?" the boy in Jiraiya's arms asked in a soft voice. He coughed up some more blood. How he could even talk was beyond the older man. "Naruto, you baka, why did you do that?" Jiraiya asked, eyes wide in horror. "I don't want to watch those dear to me die before my eyes." Neither of them noticed the flash in Orochimaru's eyes at the words. He shook his head as if to clear it. Naruto slipped from consciousness and Orochimaru began to laugh. "It seems like all your students end up dying, Jiraiya." Jiraiya's hands began to shake in anger. He leapt to the roof Sakura stood on and gently lay Naruto down, then turned and leapt back to the snake's head, preparing to end this. "My host doesn't seem too pleased with me," Orochimaru said in amusement. "There's quite a stir in the back corner of my mind where his consciousness lays." "He's still within you?" Jiraiya asked in surprise. "Don't get any sentimental ideas, Jiraiya. He's trapped in there forever." Jiraiya sighed. So there was no way to save Sasuke. He would have died trying if there was Naruto, would have wanted it. "Sharingan," Orochimaru said. Jiraiya grit his teeth as red eyes glared at him. On the roof tears streamed down Sakura's face as she used all that Tsunade had ever taught her to try and save Naruto. He wasn't dead yet, but the wound, the blood. She could feel his heart slowing as she worked, her hands glowing with chakra. "Naruto, please hang on." There were loud crashes and she looked up, watching with wide eyes as Sasuke and Jiraiya and sent jutsu after jutsu at one another. She had never seen a battle with such skills, not even the battle of Kakashi and Zabuza compared. The slowing heartbeat under her fingers suddenly stopped. "Naruto." She sent more chakra into him, desperately trying to restart his heart. "No," she sobbed, trying again and again. An explosion rattled the building she was on, and standing up quickly she saw that Sasuke had thrown Jiraiya-san with such a force he'd crashed into building, shaking it before the older man fell motionlessly to the ground. Tsunade was still fighting off Kabuto, although she now had a profound limp. Smoke was rising from everywhere in the village, buildings collapsing were punctuated by screams, and from where she stood on the roof she could see the bodies and blood littering the ground. She stared down at the blood coating her hands, then moved her gaze to Naruto who lay motionlessly on the ground. She had failed. Clenching her hands into angry fists she turned to face Sasuke, who had begun to laugh as he looked over the destruction of Konoha. After kneeling and kissing Naruto on his forehead, she stood back up, pulling a kunai from the pouch on her thigh. She wasn't strong enough, she knew. Sasuke had beaten Jiraiya-san, but she had to do something. Even if it killed her, she would not run away. Deep inside a dying boy, two great red eyes peered out of the darkness. "Oh, no," the owner of the eyes said, almost amused. "This simply won't do. One day you're going to regret this, Kit." The boy's heart had slowed so that it appeared to have stopped, but Kyuubi knew better. This kid lived on willpower alone, but that was enough. With red chakra swirling around the blonde boy's body, the hole in his shoulder began to repair, just as it had 3 years before. "Sasuke-kun," Sakura screamed. The raven-haired boy looked at her, raising an eyebrow. "You killed him. You killed Naruto." Sasuke laughed that frightening laugh. "So he finally died." As Sakura wa, tched, his eyes widened and flashed and his hands flew to his head as if he were in pain. Suddenly he stopped and straightened, a manic grin on his face. Oh my, you are angry indeed. What was he to you? He said. Sakura was confused. It didn't seem as though Sasuke was talking to her. Sasuke, you're a traitor. I can never forgive you, she cried, raising her kunai. Tsunade finally managed to get a chakra-filled punch directly to Kabuto's chest. Sending her chakra to specific points in his body, she was able to knock him unconscious. He wouldn't wake up for at least a week. Taking a moment to look around, she noted the critical situation. She almost stopped breathing when she saw Sakura arm herself. Sakura, she cried. No, that's not Sasuke. You cannot defeat him. The pink-haired girl either didn't hear her or ignored her, and rushed at Orochimaru. Don't kid yourself, girl, Orochimaru said, waiting until she was close and backhanding her away. She flew with the sheer force of the hit, falling off the snake's head. Sakura, Tsunade yelled as she watched her apprentice begin to fall from 50 feet in the air. She couldn't make it to her in time, she could barely walk. A blur of orange and red whizzed by her, leaping into the air, catching the young woman in mid-fall. Tsunade stared in amazement as Naruto suddenly stood before her, placing Sakura, who had passed out, gently on the ground. He sped away, returning a few moments later with the limp Jiraiya over his shoulder, setting him next to Sakura. Tsunade couldn't speak. Naruto's horrible wound was gone, the only indication it had ever been there was the large rip in his jacket. He was surrounded by red chakra and his features had taken on the look of a fox. His eyes were red and narrowed, his teeth long and fang-like. And his nails had lengthened into claws. Heal them, Tsunade Baba. I'll take care of this. Naruto, she called as he walked away. I'll be okay, he said, glancing back at her over his shoulder, sending her a vicious grin. She sighed, looking at Jiraiya's beaten form. Laying her palms on his chest, she began to heal him, keeping her eyes on Naruto. The boy leapt back up to the snake's head, tarring down Orochimaru with his arms crossed. So, you're not dead. Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated, Naruto growled. The fox has emerged. At least now you'll be a fun fight. Orochimaru laughed, and then paused. A faraway look in his eyes. Your friend seems to want you to run away. He seems quite attached to you. Got very emotional when you were announced dead. The news of Sasuke's consciousness had been shared to shock and surprise Naruto, and hopefully to weaken him. He wouldn't hurt Sasuke's body if he thought there was a chance the boy could be returned to it. So Naruto heard this and his lips twisted into a feral grin, fangs showing menacingly. Orochimaru was surprised, to say the least. You can tell him that he should know by now that Uzumaki Naruto never runs away. I'm still weak from having his hand rammed through my chest and I'm spending most of my energy right now trying to stop Kyuubi from taking over my body and killing everyone that isn't dead already. So if he'd really like for me not to die, he'd better reclaim his body, because I'm not going to win, but I sure as hell am not going to run. Coo, Orochimaru laughed. Well, at least you're realistic, he said. You aren't going to win. He began powering up the Chidori. This seems like a fitting way for you to die. It'll be as if it really is Sasuke ramming his hand through your heart. Naruto said nothing. Jiraiya awoke to see Tsunade hovering over him worriedly. Naruto, he gasped, sitting up. He's alive, Jiraiya, Tsunade said quickly, pointing up to where the two possessed boys stood. They watched Orochimaru power up Chidori and begin to run at Naruto, who stood firm, his arms still crossed. He's not dodging, Tsunade said with a gasp. Jiraiya tried to get up to go to him, but he was too weak and couldn't stand. Naruto, dodge, he screamed, from his knees. But Naruto didn't move. Orochimaru drew closer and Tsunade and Jiraiya watched in amazement as Ichidori suddenly went out like a candle being snuffed. Orochimaru fell to his knees, hands gripping Sasuke's hair. A loud scream wrenched from his lips. This can't be happening, he cried, then his voice changed to a different tone. No more gentle, but there was a younger, less gravelly quality to it. It was a voice Naruto knew well, slightly deeper than the last time he heard it, but it was the same voice. Get out of my body. he screamed. There was a surge of power and a scream of outrage, and as they watched the chakra swirl up around Sasuke's body they could suddenly see the shadow-way shape of a human being pulled from the boy's chest. It appeared to be trying to hold on, but it was thrust from his body and disappeared. Sasuke fell forward, to all fours, panting. The raven-haired boy looked up, red eyes having returned to their normal deep gray. He saw the blonde standing above him, surrounded by red chakra. "Naruto," he said. With what looked like considerable trouble the blonde managed to stop the red chakra. And when he opened his eyes again they were the bright blue Sasuke was used to. Naruto smiled down at him. "Sasuke," he said, "I knew you could do it." With that he collapsed, no longer able to remain standing without the strength of the Kyuubi. Sasuke moved swiftly, with energy he didn't know he had left, to catch the boy as he fell, cradling him gently. "Naruto," he said, shaking him lightly. "Naruto." Without his summoner the snake they stood on grew impatient, and with a poof it was gone. With nothing under his feet Sasuke quickly jumped to the roof next to him before leaping to the ground. He was unable to go any further and he sat down heavily, still holding the blonde close, rocking back and forth. When Tsunade and Jiraiya reached him he was crying, mumbling, "Gomen Nasai. Gomen Nasai," into Naruto's hair. It took a sleep jutsu before he would relinquish his hold on the boy. 3 days later Naruto awoke in the hospital. No one was aware of his condition except for Tsunade and Jiraiya, not even Kakashi or Iruka, who came by every day only to be told they could be given no information about either of their former students. Sasuke was still unconscious, his body needing time to recover from the strain being possessed had put on it. Orochimaru was assumed dead, his soul having nowhere to go once Sasuke had vanquished him. When Naruto had woken Tsunade had hugged him tightly. Relieved he was all right. She let him go when he didn't hug back. "Tsunade Baba," he said softly, staring at his hands. "It almost took over that time." "Naruto," she said, worriedly. "Kyuubi," he said, and then paused. "I've never been that close to losing myself. The killing intent, the power. If I had given in for even an instant everyone in the village would be dead. I almost couldn't stop him. But you did, Naruto, you stopped him. He's been trying more often," the boy said. "He what? I can constantly feel him poking in my consciousness. He's waits, Tsunade. Waits until I'm relaxed, until I'm off guard usually when I'm sleeping. Then he tries to take over. He wants out." Tsunade was shocked at the information. Why hadn't Naruto ever told her? She swallowed. This was a difficult development. "You can fight him, Naruto," she finally said. "What happens if I can't? I can't take that chance. When he saved my life he told me I'd regret it. I can feel him already, Tsunade. He took that opportunity, when I was weakest, and wove himself deeper into me. He's just right beneath the surface now. He's trying to meld us." Tsunade didn't know what to say. She was the Hokage but she had no idea what to do. This was a problem where no answers seemed apparent. Naruto continued, "I have to leave the village." "What?" Tsunade cried. "I can't be here if Kyuubi manages to take over. I will not put people I care about at risk." "Naruto, if you leave, you'll be considered a missing nin," Tsunade told him. "There's got to be a way, Tsunade Baba," he said. He pleaded. In the end it was Jiraiya that came up with the idea to tell everyone Naruto was dead. No one knew his condition. It wouldn't be far-fetched to say he'd died from his injuries. The older man had wanted to go with the boy, but Naruto had refused. Both Sannin wondered how he planned to conceal himself, for his looks caused him to stick out quite a bit. But he'd tied his hitai over his telltale blonde locks and pulled a mask over his wicker marks, so his only defining feature left was his blue eyes, which didn't seem to shine as they once had. When he appeared before them one last time, his face and hair covered and wearing navy blue and black colors rather than his normal bright orange jumpsuit, they sadly had to admit he was not easily recognizable. Before he left he had turned to Tsunade. "Tsunade-sama," he said. The respectfulness of his voice and the name left both Sannin wide-eyed. "Don't punish Sasuke, please." There was nothing she could say but, "I won't." Then, with a nod and a wave, he was gone and Tsunade had to go inform everyone who cared about him of his death. The phrase, "the reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated," a quote of Mark Twain. It was just so fitting I couldn't resist, but I couldn't not give credit where credit is due. Of Revelations. I've been agonizing over this decision for the past couple days. I've had a lot of reviews begging for yaoi. And I've had a lot pleading that I don't go down that route. Personally, I'd like to write yaoi, but I know what it feels like to get into a story then not be let to finish because you just don't like the pairings. I'm like that with Sasuke, Sakura. So, here's what I'm going to do. I have this story posted on both fanfiction net and adult fanfiction net. For those of you looking for yaoi, go to adultfanfiction.net. Here, http adult fan nexus net aff story php number 544,172,165. Add the double slash after http, and take out the spaces because fanfiction net won't let me put this link in, or go to adult fan nexus net aff and look up my name, which is Suomainanakan. Those of you who would rather this story remain about the friendship between Sasuke and Naruto, stay where you are. Up until this chapter both stories are exactly the same. So I would make sure you're at the place you want to be before continuing, because this chapter is where things start to slowly progress. I hope this works for everyone. Please let me know if there's a problem. Sasuke rolled over again, laying on his back and glaring up at the ceiling of his room as if it was the reason he was unable to sleep. He'd been so close to getting the answers he'd been searching for since Naruto's return. That is the reason I've been pretending to be dead for 10 years. Naruto had been about to go on, when there was a loud knock at Sasuke's door. Immediately, Naruto clammed up. Sasuke could feel the difference. Pulling himself into a sitting position, Naruto stood, offering his hand to Sasuke. He pulled the dark-haired man to his feet. The knocking became more insistent. Uchiha-san. They could hear from the other side of the door. Without a glance back at Sasuke, Naruto made his way out of the kitchen and down the hallway of Sasuke's one-story house. Sasuke watched him disappear into the guest room across from his room with a sigh. Stalking to the door, he pulled it open with more force than he meant to, glaring icily at the visitor. Two Junin stood on his doorstep. Sasuke was unfamiliar with the one who had been knocking and calling his name. He was young, maybe 20. The Junin behind him stood a few feet away, a distinct look of disinterest on his face. Shino, Sasuke thought, was the only other man he knew whose expression could remain as impassive and indifferent as his own. Actually, he amended, Shino was probably better at it than he was, since Sasuke's expression could usually vary to angry and, on occasion, surprised. Shino rarely even twitched an agitated eyebrow. He stood now with his hands stuffed into his pockets, round sunglasses over his eyes. Uchiha-san, the first Junin said. We were patrolling and we felt a large surge of chakra from your house. We wanted to be sure everything was all right. Sasuke almost snorted in amusement. The young Junin looked extremely anxious and Shino looked anything but concerned. He actually looked bored. Everything's fine, Sasuke said, sending a look of annoyance at the Junin. He paused. Practicing Chidori, in your house? The young man asked. He had heard tales of Chidori's destructive power. Sasuke knew the lie was pretty bad when he saw Shino make the effort to raise an eyebrow. Deciding the best route to follow was the one that worked most often, he crowed his arms and glared at both of them. Why is it suddenly your business what I do in my own house? The young Junin looked horrified to have pissed the Anbu off. He stuttered out his next words. We just wanted to be sure nothing had happened, sir. I think, Sasuke sneered, that I am more than qualified to take care of myself, don't you? Yes, sir, the Junin stammered. Shino spoke, surprising them both. Sorry to bother you, Uchiha. He turned and walked away, and the young Junin took one look at Sasuke and quickly made his way after him. With a shake of his head, Sasuke closed the door and went in search of Naruto. As he headed down the hall towards the guest room he passed the bathroom, and, hearing the gentle thrum of the shower, he realized he wouldn't get to talk to him until later. But when later came, Naruto brushed off the entire incident. He either ignored or changed the subject whenever Sasuke tried to bring it up, which was why Sasuke was now tossing in bed at 2 o'clock in the morning. Heaving a frustrated sigh, Sasuke threw off the covers and climbed out of bed. He didn't flinch as his bare feet came into contact with the cool wooden floor, used to the feeling after so many years. He only slept in his shorts and didn't bother putting on a shirt as he padded out of his bedroom. He wasn't even sure where he was going, but he knew tossing in bed was getting him nowhere. As he walked by the guest room Naruto inhabited, he couldn't help but notice the faint light glowing under the door. Pausing, he listened carefully but could hear nothing to indicate Naruto was awake. The door wasn't shut completely and Sasuke debated pushing it open slightly to see if Naruto was sleeping. He knew he could just knock, but he didn't want to wake him if Naruto was asleep. At least one of them should get some rest. Finally, he gave in, quietly pushing the door open just wide enough that he could peer in. Naruto sat in the middle of the floor, his back to the door. A small lamp sitting on the dresser that stood against the wall to his left softly illuminated the room. The other man appeared to be meditating. He was still fully dressed, including his arm wrappings. And Sasuke had to wonder if he ever changed. His face mask was pulled down, but his hair was still tied up under his hitai. Opting not to disturb him, Sasuke reached for the handle, preparing to pull the door closed. "Need something, Sasuke?" Naruto said, not turning to look at him. Sasuke paused in surprise. "I was just wondering if you were up," he finally said. Naruto did turn to look at him then. The light of the lamp caused odd shadows to dance across the contours of his face and made it difficult to read his expression. Naruto stood, and his shadow stretched across the room, reminding Sasuke of Shikamaru's Kajimane no Jutsu. "I told you I don't sleep much," Naruto said, turning from him and moving to sit on the bed that was in the corner of the room across from the dresser. "Well, I figured you'd take advantage of being here to get some rest," Sasuke told him, stepping through the door. "It's not like you'll get attacked in Konoha." Naruto snorted, catching Sasuke off guard. "It's not shinobi attacking me that I worry about," he said. "Then what?" Sasuke asked in confusion. There was a long pause as Naruto seemed to debate whether or not to tell him. "Today," Naruto finally began. "What happened in the kitchen? That was rare." Kyuubi was trying to prove a point. "He rarely tries to overpower me when I'm fully aware." Sasuke had unconsciously moved further into the room. "When I said I only sleep for a few hours, that was a lie. I'll catch half an hour here and there, but usually I don't sleep at all. When I sleep is when he strikes. The first time I woke to find him weaving his essence through me was terrifying. It took everything I had to push him back. Every time he does it, a little more of him becomes a part of me. He's trying to merge with you." "Not trying," Naruto said. And when his blue eyes looked up at Sasuke in the dim light, he swore they looked haunted. Sasuke shook his head. "Don't be stupid, Dobi," he said, refusing to believe what Naruto said could possibly be true. Naruto growled at him, and Sasuke had to admit, the sound wasn't altogether human. "I'm not being stupid," he snapped. "It's not my imagination and I'm not worrying over nothing." He turned away, refusing to look at Sasuke. "Forget it," he finally said. "I was stupid to think the great Uchiha Sasuke would understand." Sasuke felt his stomach clench at the words. Naruto had opened up to him and he'd blown it. He hesitated before moving over to the bed and sitting next to Naruto, who turned from him, giving Sasuke a good view of his profile. Naruto, Gomen. He took the time to study Naruto's features. It seemed he never had much of an opportunity, since the other man kept his mask up as much as possible. The last time Sasuke had really seen him, Naruto was 12. That brief time in battle when they were 15 didn't really count. He wasn't exactly trying to get a good look at the boy. Naruto had lost his baby fat in exchange for muscle. He had a lean, yet athletic build. His chin and jawline had become more angular. Sasuke frowned as he realized that he hadn't noticed that the whisker marks on Naruto's cheeks had grown more pronounced. They were wider and darker. "Why don't you ever take off your hitai?" Sasuke asked. "My hair would give me away, don't you think?" Naruto said with a small smile. "There's no one here but me," Sasuke reminded him. "I know," Naruto answered quietly. There was a long silence before Sasuke spoke. "Can I see your hair?" Naruto looked at him in surprise, furrowing his eyebrows. "Why?" Because I haven't seen it in 10 years. And I miss seeing the color. Naruto's eyes widened before he looked away. I told you, it gives me away. Naruto, I already know who you are, Sasuke said. It doesn't give away who I am. It gives away who I'm becoming. Sasuke frowned deeply at his words. Naruto reached up and slowly began to untie his hitai. Sasuke watched in silence as he pulled it off. Golden locks fell from the dark cloth, falling loosely around his face. They were longer than the last time Sasuke had seen them and, taking in how they gently framed Naruto's face, Sasuke was reminded of the fourth Hokage. But more was different to Naruto's hair than just the length. Reaching a hand to gently finger the locks, he let a few strands of red hair fall through his fingers. Littered throughout, the blonde strands were streaks of fiery red highlights. He looked questioningly at Naruto, who calmly allowed him to touch his hair. The more connected we become, the redder it gets, Naruto explained. It started out barely noticeable. He looked down, his expression almost seemed ashamed. When he spoke again his voice cracked and Sasuke could tell he was crying. I don't know what to do, Sasuke. I can't stop him. I'm tired, so tired. Sasuke's chest ached when Naruto started to sob. Reacting purely on instinct, he reached out and pulled Naruto to him, holding him while he sobbed into his shoulder. So what the hell's going on with Uchiha? Kiba asked, leaning his head back and downing a shot of sake. Kiba was wearing his Junin uniform, and the red marks on his cheeks became more pronounced as his face flushed from the alcohol. Akamaru sat at his feet under the table, having grown too big to perch on Kiba's head years ago. What do you mean, Kiba? Rock Lee asked from the seat across from him. Lee had grown to look almost exactly like Guy. He wore the same green training suit he had when he was younger and now he had a Junin vest over it just as his sensei wore it. The main difference between the two was Lee's round eyes, which gave him the look of perpetual innocence. The others at the round table looked to Kiba for explain. Since they had been old enough to drink the group of genin that had taken their first Chunin exam together had been coming to the bar once a week to get together and catch up on one another's lives. They always inhabited a large round table in the back corner of the dark pub. Away from the bustle that was always around the bar. The group varied from week to week. Sometimes people were on missions or had other duties, but they all came whenever their schedules allowed. Tonight Kiba, Hinata, Choji, Shikamaru, Ino, Lee, and Sakura sat around the table. They knew Kiba wasn't commenting on Sasuke not being there, because Sasuke was never there. Not for lack of trying on Sakura's part. Since Naruto's death and Sasuke's return, the moody man had barely spoken to any of them unless it was in the context of a mission. Shino told me there was some weird surge of chakra from his house today, Kiba explained. Shikamaru saw Sakura and Ino exchange odd looks. Now what was that about? Kiba continued. When he and that new Junin the twitchy one, what's his name? Ritsu. Choji offered, stuffing a radish in his mouth. Yeah, Kiba said. They went to check if everything was okay and he told him he had been practicing Chidori. In his house? Hinata asked in her soft voice. She looked as she always had. Her hair was the same short bob and the only difference in her outfit was the Chunin vest that had taken the place of her old jacket. Yeah, Kiba said with a snort. I know. Shino also said the chakra didn't feel like Chidori at all. It didn't even feel like Uchiha's chakra. Maybe it was that guy, Sakura said to Ino. What guy? Lee asked the pink-haired woman next to him. Did Shino mention him? Sakura asked Kiba. Some strange masked guy is staying with Sasuke-kun. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Uchiha, the self-imposed introvert and all-around antisocial bastard, has some stranger staying with him. Kiba said. Sakura shrugged, ignoring the insults to Sasuke. The older she got the less delusional she became. That's what he told me. This guy is really suspicious though. Ino finally spoke up, and Shikamaru realized how quiet she had been until that point. Not suspicious, Sakura, scary. Sakura looked at her sympathetic. Ali and Shikamaru's curiosity was piqued. What do you mean, Ino? He asked. Everyone was looking at her curiously. With a sigh she explained what had happened earlier that day. Shikamaru was the of person who showed very little emotion, simply because it took too much effort for him to change his expression. So when Ino told her story and his eyes progressively widened, everyone at the table found themselves staring at him. What did this guy look like? He asked her. Well, we couldn't see his face, he had a mask on, and his Hittite covered all of his hair, Ino said. Nodding and low, Saint In thought Shikamaru lifted his sake for a drink. The only thing I noticed about him was his bright blue eyes, Sakura said, almost sadly. Shikamaru choked on his sake and stood suddenly. I have to go, he said. Shikamaru, Choji said, looking up at him. See you later, he called over his shoulder before exiting the bar. What the hell was that about? Hiba asked as they all stared at the door Shikamaru had just left through. Sasuke awoke early the next morning to the smell of eggs. Sitting up and looking around in confusion, he realized he was in his guest room. He sighed, realizing T. had at some point last night he must have fallen asleep. Naruto had eventually composed himself and they'd moved off the subject of Kyuubi. Laying side by side on the bed they told one another some of the things that had happened over the last 10 years. Sasuke stopped in his room to grab a shirt before entering the kitchen. Naruto stood at his stove scrambling eggs. His mask was down around his neck and he'd put his Hittite back on. Hungry? Naruto asked when Sasuke walked in. Yeah, he answered, going to the cupboard and grabbing plates. Sorry I fell asleep, he said, holding the plates as Naruto dished out the eggs. I didn't expect you to stay up all night just because I do, Naruto said, setting the pan of eggs back on the stove and taking his plate from Sasuke. They had just saw Chi down at the table and begun to eat when there was a knock on the door. Naruto grinned. You certainly get a lot of visitors. Sasuke set his fork down in exasperation. I've had more people come here in the last 2 days than I've had all year. Naruto laughed, taking another mouthful of eggs. He remained in the kitchen as Sasuke went to answer the door. Sasuke was surprised to pull open the door and see Shikamaru. He hardly talked to the Junin, let alone received visits from him. Shikamaru, he said with a nod of acknowledgement. Sasuke, Shikamaru said in greeting. I came by to see Naruto. It was said so bluntly that all Sasuke could do was gape at him slack-jawed. Naruto, who had been listening, poked his head out of the kitchen to stare at Shikamaru, still holding his fork and earring an expression startlingly similar to Sasuke's. Ohio, Naruto, Shikamaru said, looking past Sasuke to the disembodied head that was peeking out of the kitchen. Snapping his mouth shut, Naruto shrugged with smile. Ohio, Shikamaru. Quote. The three men sat around Sasuke's kitchen table, Naruto and Sasuke staring at Shikamaru as he ate some eggs. So, Sasuke finally said. How did you know? Quote. Ino goes into the mind of some strange guy with bright blue eyes and sees he's got something residing in him. The same day there's a strange surge of chakra coming from your house where this guy happens to be staying. It doesn't take a genius to figure out. Naruto grinned. And since you are a genius, it must have been pretty simple for you. Shikamaru nodded. Did you tell anyone else? Sasuke asked. No, Shikamaru said. I figured that if it hasn't been made common knowledge, there's a reason. Yeah, Naruto said. If you could just keep it to yourself it would be appreciated. Shikamaru nodded. So why go through all the trouble of pretending you're dead? He asked. Naruto tensed and Sasuke sent a glare at Shikamaru, who pointedly ignored him. It's a long story, Shikamaru, Naruto said with a forced smile. Shikamaru studied him for a moment and Sasuke had every intention of throwing the Junin out if he pressed the subject. He would not let Shikamaru upset Naruto, not after seeing him last night. Shikamaru didn't push it though, recognizing both Naruto's discomfort and Sasuke's rising ire. Shikamaru might have asked something else but he was cut off by a poof of smoke above Naruto's head. When the smoke cleared, Sasuke and Shikamaru stared at the large orange frog that sat on Naruto's head. Naruto rolled his eyes upwards, but could only see the orange flippers that rested on his forehead. With a sigh, he said, Gamakichi, what did I tell you about popping up without being summoned? Big problems, kid, the frog said, ignoring him. Holding out his palms in front of I am Naruto allowed Gamakichi to jump into his hands. What's going on? He asked when the frog was facing him. Sasuke and Shikamaru noticed his serious tone. Akatsuki's moving towards Konoha, but on the way they are ransacking villages. Destroying everything they can. What? Naruto exclaimed. Judging by their movements, their next target is a small village about 30 miles from here. Are you sure? Naruto said. Gamatsu has been watching them like you asked. This is the only logical next move for them, Gamakichi told him. Naruto nodded. How long before they get there? 4 days, tops. That'll be enough time, Naruto said, apparently deep in thought. Enough time for what? Sasuke asked. To get there before they do, Naruto replied. He nodded to Gamakichi, who disappeared from his hands. Naruto stood. You can't be serious, Sasuke said, standing as well. Well, I'm certainly not joking, Naruto said. Don't be stupid, Sasuke growled angrily. You can't defeat all of Akatsuki by yourself. Naruto shrugged. I'll be fine. You said you would stay, Sasuke reminded him. I never said how long, Naruto countered. The Hokage ordered that you stay in Konoha. Sasuke moved to block the exit. Sasuke, I'm dead, remember. I'm not under her rules anymore. Now, if you don't get out of my way, I'll crack more than your ribs this time, Naruto said, incredibly calm. Shikamaru, who had been quietly watching the exchange, decided it might be time to interject. Naruto, taking on Akatsuki alone would be suicide. Surely you realize that. Naruto's gaze shifted to the pony-tailed shinobi, but he said nothing. In fact, he suddenly looked a bit uncomfortable. It was then Sasuke realized what Naruto was thinking. He had realized, striding across the kitchen so quickly Naruto didn't have a chance to react. He raised a fist and punched the whiskered man. Naruto's head whipped to the side and he remained that way, refusing to meet Sasuke's accusatory glare. Don't you ever think like that again? Sasuke hissed angrily. Shikamaru could do nothing but gape at them. The tense silence pervaded in the kitchen until finally Shikamaru spoke. Perhaps we should speak to the Hokage about this. The two men turned to look at him. It's likely she'll send out a large team of shinobi to protect the village, also it will be a good indication of Akatsuki's strength. Naruto sighed, and then nodded. Still not meeting Sasuke's eyes. Of enemies. Again, I'd like to say, for those of you who must have missed it last time, if you are reading this story at fanfiction.net there will be no yaoi. Those of you looking for the yaoi version should read it at adultfanfiction.net, the links are in the previous chapter. Sakura quickly made her way into the meeting room. She had just woken up when Ino had knocked on her door, telling her the Hokage had called an emergency meeting. With a frown, Sakura had rushed to get ready. Emergency meetings didn't usually involve Chunin. Junin and Anbu often went while the Chunin continued their normal duties around the village. When she entered the meeting hall it was full of shinobi, all of whom were talking amongst themselves. Spotting Ino, Lee, and Choji, she made her way through the crowd. With quick hellos she asked, so what's going on? They shrugged. No idea, Ino said. Kiba, Hinata, and Shino joined them, neither of them having any more of a clue about the reason for the meeting than they did. Ohio, everyone, a voice said. They turned to see an Anbu standing behind them. The mask was the face of a rabbit. 2 red whiskers painted along the cheeks. They recognized the Anbu immediately since her hood was down and 2 buns of black hair were visible near the top of her head. Hey, Tenten, Lee said, happy to see his old teammate. Tenten pulled her mask off and smiled at them with sparkling gray eyes. As Tenten moved closer they could see another Anbu behind her. His uniform was clearly visible, for he didn't have his robes on. Long black hair flowed from behind his mask, which was the shape of a bird. Ohio, Neji Nisan, Hinata said, bowing in greeting. Neji nodded at her. Do you guys know what's going on? Kiba asked the Anbu. No, Tenten said, shaking her head. Sasuke called us in but we haven't been told anything. Look, a booming voice called. It's my old students, together again. Guy-sensei, Lee said excitedly as the green-clad Junin strolled over to them. Asuma and Kurenai followed him, warmly greeting their former students as well. Kakashi, my rival, Guy called loudly, to the silver-haired Junin that stood across the room. Come see the young ones. Everyone was looking at their large group now, taking in the odd mixture of Chunin, Junin, and Anbu. Kakashi walked over to them. His eye narrowed into a smile as a greeting. They all fell into an easy banter until the Hokage entered the room and a hush fell. Tsunade made her way to the podium at the front of the room and all the shinobi moved in behind her as she passed. The crowd reparted quickly as the Anbu captain strode in after her, fully robed. He took his seat in the front of the room near the Hokage's advisors, Homura, Kaharu, and Shizune. The group of friends was surprised to see Shikamaru enter after Sasuke, walking next to a masked man. He leaned in, saying something to the man, who nodded. Shikamaru then walked further into the crowd and stood next to Choji. The man stayed in the back, leaning casually against the wall. Those who were in the pub the night before all gaped at Shikamaru, who stared straight ahead, not meeting anyone's gaze. "Is that the guy?" Kiba whispered to Sakura. She nodded. Akamaru whined at Kiba's feet and Kiba reached down, absently patting the dog's head. Nade spoke and any thoughts of the masked man were pushed aside. "Information regarding the Akatsuki has been brought to light. For the Chunin here, I know that you weren't aware of Akatsuki's return. However, we've deemed it necessary that you are all informed of the details. We are now definite that Akatsuki is heading towards Konoha." No one spoke, but there was a collective noise of uncomfortable shifting from the Chunin, who had not been aware that such a threat existed. With a quick glance behind her, Sakura noticed that the masked man hadn't moved from his position against the wall and he didn't seem surprised at all. Wouldn't this be new information for him? He had said he was a Chunin. Tsunade continued. As they come towards Konoha, they are attacking other villages of the Fire Country. We know where they will strike next. The reason I've called you all here is that we plan to send a large group of shinobi to intercept Akatsuki at their next target. This is a dangerous missio, and because we do not know their numbers or have a clear idea of their strength. We also have reason to believe they are being led by Orochimaru. A murmur went up through the crowd and Tsunade held up a hand to quiet them. Sakura immediately looked to Sasuke for some type of reaction, but with his mask on she could only look at his body language and he hadn't even tensed when Tsunade had made the announcement. He must have already known. There are some of you, Tsunade said. I will be asking specifically to go. Otherwise we are asking for volunteers. This is an A-class mission, so no Chunins will be forced to go. If you would like to volunteer, please see Homura, Kaharu, or Shizune. Because we cannot afford to leave Konoha unprotected, it is possible you'll be asked to remain here. Discuss among yourselves, but if you plan to volunteer, please do so before you leave. With that, the Hokage stepped down from the podium and made her way into the crowd, stopping to talk to certain Junin as she went. A buzz began immediately. Kiba pushed his way over to Shikamaru and the others gathered around the pony-tailed man as well. Shikamaru, what the hell's going on? Kiba asked. Shikamaru rolled his eyes, sighing. Don't you listen, Kiba, Tsunade-sama just explained it all. Not that, Kiba said. What happened last night, and who's that guy? He said, jabbing his thumb over his shoulder at the masked man who remained quietly in the back of the room. Everyone was waiting for Shikamaru's response, even Neji, Tenten, and Shino, who hadn't been at the pub the night before, and the old Arjunin who really had no idea what had happened. Kiba nearly jumped out of his skin when a low voice spoke right next to him. Neji, Tenten, Sasuke said to his two Anbu. The Hokage has asked me to put together a squad of Anbu for this mission and I'd like you two to be on it. He didn't bother removing his mask, even around the group of people he'd known from childhood. Hi, Tenten said, and Neji inclined his head in an affirmative. Sasuke nodded and without a word to the rest of them he turned and walked away, disappearing back into the crowd. Nice to see you too, Uchiha, Kiba said. He turned to continue his interrogation of Shikamaru, but was interrupted again when Tsunade walked over. Kakashi, Guy, I'd like for the two of you to go on the mission. They nodded. Good, she said. Report to Shikamaru tomorrow at 8 o'clock. Shikamaru, Kakashi asked. Yes. He and Sasuke will be leading this mission. Sasuke is taking care of the Anbu and Shikamaru is commanding the Junin and any Chunin that volunteer. Guy and Kakashi looked at one another as she moved away, telling Lee, Kiba, Shino, and Choji that she wanted them on the mission. Do you suddenly feel extremely old? Guy asked. Kakashi nodded, glancing at their leader, who seemed to be watching his companions with little interest. In fact, One could say he looked bored. Sakura, Ino, and Hinata rejoined the group, having gone and volunteered. The room began to empty out as those who had volunteered and those who weren't planning to left. Ino looked over to where the masked man stood, arms folded and eyes closed as he leaned against the wall. I wonder if he's going to volunteer, she said to no one in particular. Kakashi-sensei, Sakura said to the silver-haired Junin, who stood near Guy. Do you know anything about that guy? Glancing in his direction, Kakashi was startled to see blue eyes meet his gaze, but made no outward indication of his surprise. No, Sakura, I'm just as in the dark as you are. He held eye contact with the man for a moment, until the blue eyes closed once again. Everyone turned to Shikamaru, whose eyes were half-lidded and almost looked as though he was going to attempt sleeping standing up. What? He asked when he noticed all the eyes on him. You were talking to him, Ino said. Do you know who he is? Shikamaru shrugged. We've met. Everyone, including the older generation of Junin, who were equally as curious about the stranger, was about to launch into questions when Sasuke walked back up to the group. Ready? Sasuke asked flatly, as if he really didn't care one way or the other. There was a bit of confusion at the question since, 1. Sasuke rarely spoke to any of them, and 2. His mask prevented them from seeing where exactly his question was directed. Shish. Ikamaru put an end to the confusion by sighing and saying, how troublesome, before following Sasuke over to the masked man. Pushing himself from the wall, he greeted them with a curt nod before the three of them left, completely ignoring the rest of them. Okay, seriously, Kiba said when they had departed. What the hell is going on? Akamaru barked. What are you doing here, old man? Naruto asked. They were bringing up the rear in a long line of shinobi. There were about 50 ninjas picked for the mission and they were making their way quickly towards the village Gamakichi had warned Naruto about. Naruto sighed, thinking about how much quicker he could have gotten there if he'd just gone himself. Jiraiya threw him an irritated look at the question. I'm not one to miss an opportunity to kick Orochimaru's ass. Naruto's eyes appeared thoughtful. I don't ever recall you kicking Orochimaru's ass. In fact, every time I've seen you face him you've ended up as a human crater. Jiraiya thwapped him on the head. No respect. Quote. Naruto's eyes crinkled in a grin, but the expression fell when he felt eyes on him again. Looking ahead to the middle of the line he saw a pair of pale, pupil-less eyes staring at him. When he met Hinata's gaze she blushed and turned quickly. Naruto sighed. At least she hadn't been using Byakugan. Who knew what she would see? Ever since the mission had begun, people had been sneaking looks at him, as if watching him would help them figure out the mystery he presented. He'd caught everyone from Ino to Kakashi. He was pretty certain he'd even seen the stoic Shino watching him as well. But with the sunglasses it was difficult to tell. Popular, aren't we? Jiraiya teased. If I had known the best way to get everyone's attention was to be as quiet and unobtrusive as possible, I wouldn't have tried being so annoying when I was a kid, Naruto said in exasperation. Jiraiya laughed. It's the mask, he said. It adds to the mystery. Naruto shrugged. Sasuke suddenly appeared beside them. He was wearing his armor and mask, his katana strapped across his back. Blue eyes rolled as Sasuke fell into step with them. I'm still here, Sasuke, Naruto said, obviously irritated. I know, the Anbu replied. This was not the first time Sasuke had checked up on him. Whether Sasuke was afraid he was going to run off or try and kill himself right there on the walk to the village, Naruto wasn't sure. But it was beginning to annoy him. Stop playing mother hen and get back to your troops, Naruto snapped a little louder than he'd intended. The fox mask turned towards him. But Naruto had no idea what type of expression it hid. Finally Sasuke grunted and disappeared, presumably returning to the head of the line with the rest of the Anbu. Those who could hear the conversation were wide-eyed. No one dared talk to the Anbu captain like that, not even those who had known him when he was younger. Kakashi and Guy, who had remained towards the back of the line, exchanged glances. Their curiosity piqued even further. The metal roof tiles were cool under his hands when he leaned back, his weight on his arms as he stared up into the night sky. From his posy Chion on the roof of a bakery that was closed for the night, he could see several shinobi pacing the outskirts of the village on sentry duty, looking for any sign of Akatsuki. They'd arrived at the village just before sundown. The villagers had been surprised but cooperative, grateful for protection. They had heard what was happening in the other villages. Everything was quiet so far. The villagers, and most of the shinobi were sleeping and resting for the battle that was likely to begin the next day. Naruto had managed to sneak away from the watchful eyes of Sasuke and Shikamaru. He and Sasuke hadn't actually been speaking since the day before, save for Naruto telling him to leave him alone several times throughout the journey to the village. When they'd returned to Sasuke's house after the meeting, Shikamaru and Sasuke spoke about strategies and Naruto went to the guest room to meditate. After Shikamaru had left, the entire house seemed filled with nearly tangible tension between Sasuke and Naruto. Sasuke had obviously not been prepared to find out Naruto valued his life at so little, and Naruto had not been prepared for Sasuke's angry reaction to this information. He heard feet land lightly on the shingles behind him. Turning his head slightly, he watched as he corrected when the man's face was illuminated by the moonlight. Lee walked over to him. "Ah," Lee said softly when he could see Naruto. His hair and face were still covered, but he'd now become recognizable as the mysterious masked man. "Sorry to disturb you," Lee said, drawing even with him. "I saw a shadowy figure on the roof and thought I should check it out." "It's okay," Naruto said, returning his gaze to the stars that twinkled brightly above them. "My name's Rock Lee," the dark-haired man said, extending his hand down to him. "Nice to meet you," Naruto said, grasping Lee's calloused palm, but not offering his name. If Lee noticed he hadn't been given a name, he made no comment. "So," he said, "how do you know Uchiha Sasuke? The Hokage is making me stay with him." "It wasn't a lie," Lee nodded, looking up at the stars. "I can't imagine he's much fun to live with," he said. Naruto shrugged, a small smile pulling at his hidden lips. "He's definitely a broody bastard." Lee grinned down at him. "He's always been like that," he said. Of course he wasn't quite as bad before, he cut himself off with a frown. Naruto looked up at him curiously. "Before what?" "Well, he's never been quite the same since a friend of his died," Lee said sadly. "Actually, none of us have. Konoha never seemed so quiet until he was gone." Naruto looked down at the roof tiles, his stomach turning with regret. His friends had missed him. He'd often wondered if that would be the case or if his absence would go mostly unnoticed, not affecting anyone's lives. How he wished he could speak to them again, the way he used to. Just be the careless, stupid person he once was, annoying his friends. He shook his head slightly. He had made the right decision. He was protecting these people, and to do that they must not know he still existed. He had no regrets. Already he had spent too much time around them. Any moment with him was a moment in danger. Whether they knew it or not. His resolve strengthened. After this mission he'd leave, with or without Tsunade Baba's permission or Sasuke's knowledge. "Well," Lee said, breaking Naruto's train of thought, "I should get back to sentry duty." Naruto sent him a nod and the green-clad man leapt from the roof, gracefully landing on the ground and making his way back through the village. It was a few moments before the presence Naruto had sensed while speaking with Lee decided to make himself known. "Hiding yourself from your old friends, Naruto-kun." With a sigh, Naruto stood, turning to face the newcomer. Naruto grimaced as he took in the white-haired man's appearance. His skin was pulled tightly over his face, giving him an emaciated look. He no longer wore high-s glasses and his eyes bulged unnaturally from his face. "The years have not been kind to you, Kabuto," Naruto said. "Or, I suppose I should call you Orochimaru." Kabuto's face broke into a manic grin. "Yes, Kabuto was kind enough to lend me his body when Sasuke-kun rebelled." "Are you here to reclaim him?" Naruto asked, crossing his arms over his chest. "No," Orochimaru said. "I thought he was the body I wanted. But I've since revised my opinion." Naruto watched him speak with a guarded expression. "See, I always thought of you as a little Jiraiya, stupid and not very talented." He paused, waiting for Naruto to react, but continued, when Naruto simply gazed at him flatly. "But, Jiraiya has proved that luck and persistence can make you strong. You, Naruto-kun, your luck was having Kyuubi sealed in you. Unlimited power at your fingertips." Naruto did raise an eyebrow at that. Orochimaru could not possibly be suggesting what he seemed to be suggesting. Uchiha Itachi had the right idea coming after you. Your stupidity made me overlook you before, but once I control your body that particular weakness won't be a problem. And I'll have the power of Kyuubi to use as I please. Apparently, Naruto thought, Orochimaru was suggesting exactly what he seemed to be suggesting. What makes you sure you can control Kyuubi's power? Naruto asked. Who, Orochimaru laughed. Do you realize who you're talking to? Rolling his eyes, Naruto muttered, an overconfident bastard. Louder he said, there's only one problem with this theory of yours. I would have to be willing. And I'm not. Orochimaru laughed again and Naruto grit his teeth at the irritating sound. 10 years ago, yes, you would have had to be willing. But I've discovered a new jutsu since then. Now, you just have to be unconscious. Naruto's eyes widened as Kabuto's mouth opened and Orochimaru's tongue flew from his mouth. He quickly dodged, but the tongue followed him. He had to use his full speed to avoid being hit. Dashing across the rooftop, he pulled out several shuriken, flinging them at Orochimaru, who leapt into the air to dodge. Naruto used this chance to get in close, avoiding the tongue. Chakra began to gather in his right palm. Oh no you don't, Orochimaru said, recognizing the technique. He retracted his tongue at a high speed, purposely slamming it into the back of Naruto's head. Stars burst in front of his eyes and Naruto fell to his knees in front of the snake-like man, the chakra in his hand disappearing. With a smirk, Orochimaru swiftly brought his knee up, catching Naruto hard in the jaw and sending him sprawling across the roof. Lowering his mask momentarily to spit out blood, Naruto shakily started to make his way to his feet. A kick to his ribs from Orochimaru sent him sliding along the roof tiles and dangerously close to the edge. He saw the tongue speeding towards him but was unable to dodge as it wrapped around his leg, pulling him upside down into the air. Lee felt a strong gathering of chakra and turned to see the masked man he'd just been speaking with fighting with a strange man on the roof he'd just left. Calling to a nearby Chunin to inform Shikamaru and Sasuke, he and several sentries made their way quickly towards the fight. They arrived in time to see the masked man lifted into the air by the other's tongue, which was impossibly and disgustingly long. Lee watched as the man used his tongue to throw the masked man off the roof. He hit the ground painfully hard and rolled towards Lee before the momentum of the throw wore out and his limp body skidded to a stop. Running towards him, Lee dropped to a knee to make sure he was still alive. The man was bloodied and bruised on the small part of his face that he could see, and his arm was bent in a very unnatural way, presumably from the fall. He was unconscious, but alive. Get a medical nin, Lee told one of the sentries, who hurried away. 2 puffs of smoke announced the arrival of Sasuke and Shikamaru, who quickly took in the situation. As soon as he saw the masked man laying on the ground, Sasuke quickly kneeled next to him, across from Lee. Sasuke hadn't bothered to put his mask on, and Lee was surprised at the worry splayed across the normally stoic man's face. Assured that he was still breathing, Sasuke stood, glaring angrily at the man on the roof. Ah, Sasuke-kun, the man said. Just in time to witness me take my new body. Quote, Sasuke's eyes grew wide when he recognized Orochimaru's voice as the white-haired man began making seals. He didn't know what to do to protect Naruto, but he'd be damned he'd let that snake take control of him the way he had been taken control of. But before Sasuke could do anything, Orochimaru stopped, opening his eyes and laughing. You're better than I gave you credit for, he said, looking at Naruto's still form. I'll do this next time I see you. And with that he had disappeared. Sasuke, Shikamaru, Lee and the 3 other sentries looked curiously at the unconscious man on the ground. Sasuke went back to kneel by Naruto's side. What did Orochimaru mean? Naruto seemed to pose no threat. With a poof, the sentry Lee had sent off appeared, Sakura with him. Her pink hair was sticking every which way, having come directly after being roused from sleep. She saw Sasuke kneeling next to the masked man and rushed to the injured man's side, shooing Sasuke away to get room to work. Quickly assessing the damage, she moved to use her chakra to begin healing and nearly screamed when her patient disappeared in a poof of smoke. They all stared at the empty spot in amazement. Don't waste your chakra, a voice said. Turning, they saw the masked man emerge from the shadow of the building the fight had taken place on, looking no more injured than when Lee had spoken to him. The replacement technique, Lee said in confusion. No, Sakura said, glancing at the space in front of her, which was devoid of any logs. She would have known if it was a normal fake. She had felt chakra in the clone in front of her. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. Of exposure. Who is this guy? Sakura said angrily, pointing at Naruto, who was sitting at the head of a long rectangular table. After Orochimaru had disappeared, they had moved to the meeting room the inn had provided for them. Lee stood next to Sakura, a calming hand on her arm, looking curiously between Sasuke, who stood silently behind Naruto. For once having his Anbu mask hanging from his hip instead of covering his face, and Shikamaru, who was sitting a few seats from Naruto, his cheek resting on his palm. Sakura continued, he said he's a Chunin, but he can hold a Kage Bunshin long enough that the clone appeared injured. That's incredibly difficult. How did he even learn the technique? It's forbidden. No Chunin should be able to perform it. Sakura, we did know a shinobi who could use Kage Bunshin as a genin, Lee reminded her, not noticing the other three men in the room shift subtly at his words. This is different, Lee. Naruto was trustworthy. Naruto didn't know whether to be pleased she thought so highly of him or offended that she didn't consider the current him trustworthy. It was bizarre to be praised and insulted in the same sentence. Silence had descended over the room. It was rare that Naruto was talked about, even among those he had been closest to. It was a wound that had never fully healed. There was also an unspoken agreement that the subject was never broached around Sasuke, and now Lee and Sakura were watching him warily for a reaction. Shikamaru might have been slightly worried himself if he hadn't known Naruto was sitting in front of Sasuke looking slightly puzzled at the sudden quiet. Shikamaru finally spoke. Sakura, he said, Tsunade, Jiraiya, Sasuke, and I fully trust him. There's no cause for alarm. Shikamaru, he knows a forbidden jutsu. Plus remember what Ino said. Can everyone stop talking about me as if I'm not sitting right here? Naruto interjected, eyebrows raised. Everyone turned to him. He was looking at Sakura. I told you I was technically a Chunin, he said. I've never taken the Junin exam so I can't claim to be one, but my skills are likely at Junin level. Then why didn't you tell us that up front? Sakura demanded. Because the way you and Ino talk it is impossible to get a word in edgewise. Naruto said in exasperation. It grew quiet for a moment as Naruto rolled his eyes and the other three men in the room awaited Sakura's response with bated breath. She did not take criticism well. Sure enough. Who the hell do you think you are? She yelled, making to lunge for him. For his part Naruto didn't even flinch. Lee managed to get a hold of her before she could get anywhere. Shikamaru sighed. Women were so troublesome. Sasuke chose to ignore Sakura. Well, at least we know for certain that Orochimaru's alive. Sakura quieted down. And what he's after, Shikamaru added, glancing at Naruto. Naruto stood. Are we done? I'm going to bed. Shikamaru appeared thoughtful, then he nodded. It was fast approaching dawn. The last thing he wanted was several of his most skillful companions ill-rested. Go ahead. Turning to the rest of the shinobi in the room he said, all of you should get some sleep as well. Orochimaru's nearby. Battle could begin at any time. With one last glare at Naruto, Sakura left in a huff. Lee trailing after her after smiling at them. Sasuke watched as Naruto walked out without another word. With a quick goodbye to Shikamaru he trailed after him. Naruto had said he was going to bed but Sasuke knew that couldn't be true. And there were things they needed to talk about. The silent treatment had gone on long enough. Sasuke only gave a short knock of warning before walking into Naruto's room. It was furnished just as his own room down the hall was. A bed was in the center, with a nightstand next to it, one chair, and a set of dressers stood against the far wall. The room was dark, and Sasuke almost thought that Naruto hadn't come back until he caught sight of the light in the corner where the bathroom door was slightly ajar. He removed his katana and set it near the door, his mask resting on the hilt. Naruto, he said, pushing the door open. Naruto's back was to the door and he was hunched over the sink. Sasuke heard him spit before he straightened, seemingly ignoring him. He wiped his mouth then took a drink from the glass of water in his hand, sloshing it around his mouth with a grimace before leaning over and spitting again. This time Sasuke saw the red tint the water had to it as it disappeared into the sink. Naruto straightened again, not turning, but meeting Sasuke's gaze in the mirror that hung over the sink. "Haven't you heard of knocking?" he said. "Are you hurt?" Sasuke asked, completely ignoring his question. "I bit my tongue when Orochimaru kneed me in the jaw," Naruto said with a shrug, taking another mouthful of water. "I thought that was a clone," Sasuke said. "No," Naruto said after spitting again. "I didn't get a chance to cage Bunshin until the bastard almost knocked me off the roof." He was so pleased with himself he didn't notice the real me slide down from the building. "You should have told Sakura you were hurt, she could have healed you." "And pulled down my mask, discovered who I am, faint, recover, and tell everyone within a 20-mile radius," Naruto said. "I'll take my chances with the glass of water. Besides, it'll be healed in a few hours anyway." Sasuke grimaced at the overt mention of Kyuubi. He backed out of the bathroom as Naruto made to exit, setting the cup on the sink as he did. Sasuke watched as he made his way to the bed, flopping down on his back and draping an arm over his eyes. "Oh, what I wouldn't give to sleep," he murmured, so low that Sasuke almost didn't catch it. The raven-haired man felt a wave of intense anger at the fox. It wasn't fair that Naruto had to deal with this. No one should have to. No wonder Naruto was thinking about Naruto. Sasuke asked. A weary, was his reply. Sasuke wasn't sure he really wanted to broach this subject, but he continued anyway. "The other day, when you said you were going to face Akatsuki alone," Sasuke fumbled for the words and Naruto sat up, patiently waiting for him to speak. It was rare to see the other man so flustered and Naruto smirked lightly as Sasuke searched for a way to say what he wanted to say. Do you really want to?" Sasuke stopped, looking uncomfortable, and Naruto decided to put the poor man out of his misery. He knew what Sasuke was trying to ask. "Yes," he said, meeting Sasuke's eyes. "I would like to die." Sasuke sucked in a breath. He hadn't been expecting such a direct answer. "But, Sasuke, I haven't slept more than an hour at a time since I was 17. Any normal man would be dead already. If it weren't for Kyuubi's refusal to let me drop dead from exhaustion I would be. I am slowly losing myself to a demon that will kill everything in its sight if given the chance. I rarely have human contact for fear that somehow people will discover I'm alive. The only company I ever have is from frogs, and even that is rare. Everyone I know thinks I'm dead. Do you have any idea what a tired, miserable, and lonely existence I led? Dying would be a relief I can't even begin to comprehend." "I know you're alive," Sasuke snapped. "Isn't that enough?" He had lived through the loss of his friend once, but the idea of trying to do it again was unfathomable. "You shouldn't know that I'm alive, Sasuke. It's not safe for anyone to know. That's why I left in the first place. I can protect myself. Don't act like I'm helpless. Who are you to say we can't know you're alive?" Sasuke said angrily. "What gives you the right to make that choice for us? No one can protect themselves from this," Naruto said. "This is not some shinobi. This is Kyuubi. That's not the point. You should give us the option. Are you afraid we'd choose to leave you alone? Is that why you ran away?" "No," Naruto whispered. "I was deathly afraid that for some stupid, stubborn reason, people would choose to stay with me. I cannot watch those important to me die by my hands. I refuse to do it." Sasuke didn't answer him. They hadn't noticed, but the morning sun had begun to peer through the window. There was a sound of a knock, and Sasuke went to answer the door, grateful for the distraction. Neji stood in the hall, fully dressed, including his mask. "They're coming," he said simply. Sasuke was instantly sobered by the news. "Shikamaru knows." Neji nodded. "He's outside now. Gather the rest of the Anbu, we'll meet outside in 5 minutes. "Hi," Neji said, disappearing. Sasuke closed the door, turning to see Naruto. His mask once again in place. Naruto shrugged. "Duty calls." Sasuke grabbed his fox mask and katana from their position against the wall and secured them into their places. "Let's go end this," he said. Shikamaru looked towards the hill the village sat next to, watching grimly as figure after figure appeared atop it, silently staring down at them. They had known that Akatsuki as growing in numbers, but none of them had imagined by this much. Shikamaru had some of the best ninjas Konoha had to offer standing with him, but being outnumbered at what he estimated was 15-1 was not encouraging odds. Konoha ninjas were gathered at the bottom of the hill looking up at the vast amount of shinobi above them. Some of Shikamaru's men had been sent to warn the villagers, eating them away from where the battle would take place. Jiraiya suddenly appeared next to Shikamaru, giving the younger man a nod. Looking further to his left, he could see several other shinobi, including Kakashi and Guy, as well as Lee, Sakura, and Ino. Choji, Kiba, Shino, and Hinata stood in various positions on his right. With a small smile, Shikamaru began to feel more confident. These were excellent ninjas and he would trust his life to any of them. He could think of no better honor than to fight by their sides. With a puff of smoke, Sasuke and Naruto appeared in front of him, Tenten, Neji, and 2 other Anbu behind them. They nodded in greeting at Shikamaru, before turning to survey the enemy. "You know, Sasuke," Naruto said, "I think I liked Akatsuki better when Itachi was in charge. They were less destructive, more goal-oriented, and most importantly, much smaller." The Konoha shinobi hadn't been speaking, but at the masked man's words a tense silence overtook them. Everyone, even those who had never met Sasuke, knew of Itachi and the destructive means Sasuke had gone to for revenge. They awaited Sasuke's response in anxiety, wondering if perhaps this masked shinobi would be the first to fall today. The white fox mask slowly turned to the blue-eyed man, who looked steadily at the wooden face. "I'm going to beat the shit out of you when this is over," the voice from behind the mask said. The blue eyes twinkled. "Promise?" "Yes." Several shinobi breathed sighs of relief, others shivered at the thought of Uchiha Sasuke's wrath. Only a select few, Jiraiya and Shikamaru, who knew their history, Kakashi and Guy, who understood friendly rivalry, and, of course, Naruto and Sasuke saw the meaning behind the words. "We're both going to survive this." "Promise?" "Yes." There was a shift at the top of the hill and Orochimaru in Kabuto's body rode into view, standing comfortably on the head of a giant snake. The flashy snake entrance isn't quite as intimidating after you've seen it so many times, Naruto said quietly, rolling of his eyes. Sasuke nodded in agreement. "Konoha ninjas," Shikamaru said loudly so that all of those under his command could hear him. "Our mission is to protect this village and stop Akatsuki, no matter what the cost. What we do today protects Konoha. If we fail, this army is headed towards our village. Protect Konoha." There was a loud sigh of agreement from the shinobi behind him. Orochimaru laughed, folding his arms across his chest. With a simple nod to his subordinates, the shinobi at the top of the hill began to charge. Arming themselves with kunai, shuriken, and other weapons, the ninja of Konoha prepared for battle. Sasuke and the 4 Anbu behind him pulled their katana from their backs. Naruto noticed that Neji and Tenten had weapons that differed from their comrades. Neji held a long dagger in his hand while Tenten had 2 katana that were shorter than the others. Spinning them once to get a solid grip on them, she made her way quickly to the right flank. Followed by Neji, the other 2 Anbu moved to the left, leaving Sasuke and Naruto in the middle. Naruto had never seen Sasuke wield a katana, but he was not surprised at the fluidity and grace of his movements as the first of the enemy reached them and were instantly struck down. Sasuke stabbed one Akatsuki member and, wrenching the katana from the man's abdomen, he spun to strike at another. Naruto didn't have time to admire Sasuke's skills for long, however, for the sheer numbers the Akatsuki possessed had descended upon him and his attention had to be focused on his own battles. Fortunately, Naruto noticed as he ducked a punch aimed for his jaw, the prestige that members of the Akatsuki formerly possessed did not seem to apply to them anymore. These ninjas were not S-class nin. Many of them weren't even Junin. It appeared that Orochimaru was going for strength in numbers. With a swift blow to the head with the blunt end of his kunai, the shinobi attacking Naruto fell face first into the grass. Naruto sensed rather than saw the kick coming from behind him and, turning quickly, he grabbed the attacker's ankle. With a sharp downward thrust of his elbow he broke the other man's leg at its joint. Naruto let him go and he toppled over, clutching desperately at his knee, his cries joining in with the yells and screams of others on the hill that had turned into a battlefield. Leaping into the air, Naruto dodged 2 kunai that had been thrown at him and they embedded into the ground with soft thunks. A fist came at him from nowhere and he blocked it. punching his assailant in the stomach. Shinobi began charging him in pairs. This was ridiculous. Every time one was struck down, 3 more would take his place. Chancing a glance around, he saw that Konoha's already small force was rapidly declining. Sakura had given up fighting and was now tending to the injured of their side, as were several other medical nins. The Anbu were faring well. Their swords allowed them to kill many enemies with ease, and close-range fighting was their specialty. Neji could maneuver easily with his dagger, getting in close to his enemies and cutting off their chakra flow with his free hand or limbs with his dagger. Naruto grimaced as he saw a man on his knees in front of Tenten, remaining absolutely still. Her twin blades were crossed in front of his neck, pulling her arms apart quickly. The man's neck was sliced open, blood splattering across her white mask. A flash of pink caught Naruto's eye, and he watched Sakura run to Kiba, who had just killed several sword-wielding Akatsuki members, but had sustained a deep wound in his leg for his trouble. Naruto looked to Sasuke and grimly noticed that even he appeared to be struggling with the never-ending onslaught of enemies. No matter how many were killed, more continued coming. They needed more fighters. At this rate they couldn't possibly win. He tossed a kunai into the heart of an advancing attacker before gritting his teeth. This was most likely going to blow his cover. Between Kakashi's Sharingan, the Hyuga's Byakugan, Kiba's nose, and Sakura's intelligence, he had no doubt someone, if not everyone, would figure him out. But what was the point of protecting them from himself only to let them die in battle? Raising his hands, he crossed 2 fingers of his right hand vertically over 2 of his left. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. He could hear the pause in the fighting as ally and enemy alike looked around in amazement at the hundreds of masked figures that had appeared in the fray. Seeing the confusion to his advantage, the Narutos began to attack. The Konoha ninjas recovered from their surprise and resumed fighting with renewed vigor. Several shinobi had to struggle to get their heads back into the battle, however, for they now knew the identity of the masked man. Of trust. They were winning, Kakashi realized with relief. With the help of several Naruto clones, for there was only one man with the chakra to create this many Kage Bunshins, and one look with his Sharingan confirmed that the masked man was indeed Naruto. He and Guy slowly began making their way through the Akatsuki and towards Orochimaru. Pushing the shock and other emotions he felt at the knowledge of Naruto being alive and well into the back of his mind for the time being, he concentrated on the battle at hand. It wouldn't do to get distracted. Orochimaru was strong, but if he worked with Naruto and Guy, perhaps they would be able to defeat him. Guy seemed to read his thoughts, for when the 2 of THM made it through the shinobi that separated them from Orochimaru, they both began to run towards him, the beginnings of Chidori in Kakashi's right palm. They skidded to a stop when one of the Narutos suddenly appeared in front of them. Hands raised to stop them. "Naruto, what are you doing?" Kakashi asked, allowing Chidori to fade away. Guy choked in surprise when Kakashi addressed the other man, looking quickly at his masked face for confirmation that this was indeed the boy from 10 years before. If Naruto was surprised that Kakashi had figured him out, he didn't show it. "You should probably stay here, Kakashi-sensei." "Guy-sensei, why is that?" Kakashi asked, refusing to let his old student stop him from getting to Orochimaru without a good reason. Naruto looked over his shoulder and they followed his gaze, watching as another Naruto seemed to be pleading with Jiraiya, who stood not far from Orochimaru's snake. "Ero Sennin is about to do something very stupid." Naruto looked back at them, glancing behind them. "Your old students need some help," he said with a quick nod in the direction they weren't facing before disappearing back into the fight. They turned to see Lee struggling to fight off an extremely large group ninja, protecting Sakura, who was a short distance behind him, working intently on Kiba's leg. Akamaru crouched loyally in front of his owner, trying to take care of anyone who made it past Lee. They quickly went to help, leaving Orochimaru to Jiraiya. "Ero Sennin, this is a bad idea," Naruto said as Jiraiya bit his thumb. "There are too many people here. Plus he told me that the next time you summoned him he was going to eat you." Naruto frowned. "What the hell did you do?" Jiraiya paused for a moment, looking grim. "One of his sons was killed, probably by Akatsuki, while gathering information for me." "Information on what?" Naruto asked. "On you." "Me," Naruto said, confused. "Tsunade and I worry about you, kid." We checked up on you now and then. Naruto stared at him in surprise. He'd just assumed everyone would have moved on when he was gone. The more people he talked to, the more it seemed he had never been more wrong. Naruto smiled under his mask, a warm tingle of happiness filling him. At his distraction, Jiraiya did the hand seals and slammed his palm to the ground. Baka, Naruto said, leaping backwards, warm feeling gone. With a poof of smoke, Naruto found himself next to an extremely large red flipper. The fighting on the hill slowed as the shinobi took in the sight of the gigantic frog that had suddenly appeared. Gamabunta rolled his eyes upwards to see who stood on his head, much as Naruto did when Gamakichi perched on his. When he discovered Jiraiya, Naruto could feel the anger radiate from the frog. Jiraiya, he boomed, the pipe in his mouth bouncing. How dare you summon me after what you have done? His rough tongue flew up to grab the Sannin, but Naruto called to him. Boss. Gamabunta paused, looking down at him and retracting his tongue. What are you doing here, brat? Don't eat the pervert, boss, Naruto said. If anyone killed your son, it was Akatsuki. He pointed to Orochimaru, who was only paying mild attention to them from his snake. Orochimaru is their leader. You should extract your revenge on them. Gamabunta growled at Orochimaru, a surprising noise to hear from a frog. Fine, he said, but I want you with me, not him. I can't, boss, Naruto said, pointing behind him. I'm a little busy at the moment. Gamabunta looked over his shoulder at the battle raging behind him, taking in all the clones. Besides, Ero Sennin is more powerful than me, he said to the frog. Gamabunta snorted. I wouldn't be so sure. Jiraiya looked ready to say something uncouth, but Gamabunta continued. Fine, Jiraiya, let's get this over with. He reached behind him, unsheathing his katana. Boss, try not to crush us down here, Naruto called. Baka, Gamabunta said. I don't put any of my sons in danger. Jiraiya looked around the battlefield for the younger frogs. His eyebrows furrowed in confusion when he didn't spot any. It was when he saw Naruto pat the frog's large flipper fondly before running off into battle that he realized with wide eyes that Gamabunta had been referring to none other than Naruto himself. To be held in such high favor by Gamabunta, what had happened between them over the years? That frog, Sasuke said to the Naruto fighting next to him. Is he the one you summoned when we were young? Blocking a punch and smashing his fist into his opponent's face, Naruto answered. Yeah, that's Gamabunta. If frogs were ninjas, he'd be the Hokage. Sasuke nodded, slicing through an enemy's stomach with a swipe of his katana. When the man fell to the ground in a STI. Heap, Sasuke flicked some blood from his katana with a jerk of his wrist. If either man thought that carrying on a conversation in these conditions was odd, they didn't act like it. Kage Bunshin probably gave you away, Sasuke said, spinning and kicking a man away from him. It was one thing when you did one, but this many is bound to cause some suspicion. Yeah, Naruto grunted, ducking a punch. I talked to Kakashi. He definitely knows. It was strange for Sasuke to think that Naruto was in so many places at once. He knew these were clones, but they all communicated as if they were a single person. One was fighting at his side while another was talking to Kakashi, but both knew exactly what was happening on each end. It must be an incredible task to keep them all straight. So where's the real you? Sasuke asked, looking through the slits of his Anbu mask to see a Naruto pat Gamabunta on the flipper before jumping back into the battle. With the frog, the real me does need to handle the most important things. Of course, Naruto answered. Orochimaru was growing tired of this battle. He was losing too many men and he was not in the mood to fight Jiraiya and his pet. His new body was so close. Just slightly down the hill. Most people couldn't tell the difference between the real man and the clones, but he could feel the intoxicating power of Kyuubi in only one of the masked men. He just needed Naruto unconscious. The young man was strong, however, stronger than Orochimaru could have hoped and smarter than he had realized. He'd underestimated him before, this time there would be no mistakes. But as he watched the real Naruto, he realized what his weakness was. As Jiraiya and Gamabunta prepared to attack him, he made his move. Lifting his arm, he signaled his men to draw back. They retreated behind him, leaving the Konoha fighters confused. The snake he rode on then drove his thick tail into the ground, the signal for the other giant snake, which had burrowed underground and was lying in wait. To make its move, several Konoha ninjas were tossed into the air as the snake emerged from the ground in a flurry of earth and rocks. Its fangs were bared and it flew directly at its target, who was caught off guard and unable to get away. Sasuke could only watch as the snake came at him with speeds even he had no hope of outrunning. He felt a sharp jar in the woe. RLD titled as he found himself tumbling down the hill. Regaining himself, he rolled to his feet, slightly dazed, before turning to look at the spot he'd been standing in. The Naruto he had been fighting with was there panting, his right hand gripping a kunai that was digging into the snake's nose, looking very small against the large face. One of the snake's sharp fangs was impaled through Naruto's left forearm. Sasuke waited for the proof of a defeated clone and felt his stomach twist with every second it didn't occur. Then the familiar popping noise sounded, and he and the other Konoha ninjas watched as the 50 or so remaining clones disappeared. The snake suddenly ripped his fang from Naruto's arm, blood flying through the air as he raised his head, hissing viciously. He snapped his jaws, but before he was able to even think about attacking again, his head had been detached from his body, each part falling heavily to the ground. Gamabunta now stood between the two pieces of snake, gripping his sword tightly. Sasuke moved swiftly to Naruto, who seemed slightly dizzy. When he reached him, the other man teetered on his feet and Sasuke quickly sheathed his sword, catching him as he wobbled. Naruto's knees gave out and Sasuke supported his weight, lowering him gently to the ground. "I thought you were with the frog," Sasuke said, amazed to find out that the real Naruto had been by his side the entire battle. "You idiot, why didn't you use a clone to push me out of the way?" "I told you," Naruto said, breaths coming heavily. "Important things have to be handled by the real me." Sakura rushed to them. She had no idea why Akatsuki had stopped fighting, but she wasn't going to look a gift horse in the mouth. Most eyes were on the wounded young man, even Jiraiya and Gamabunta's and especially Orochimaru's. The pink-haired medical nin checked his wound first. The thick fang had fractured Naruto's arm when it had impaled him and he was bleeding heavily. Sakura quickly noted his shallow breathing and, moving his head protector just a bit, she felt his forehead for a fever. He was burning up. "The snake must have been poisonous," she said, and Sasuke's hands clenched into angry fists. Sakura leaned over Naruto, placing her hand gently on his covered hair. "Do you feel any pain?" She paused before finishing the question softly with, "Naruto." Sasuke looked at her in surprise. She had finally figured it out. They could see Naruto smile under his mask. "You were always too smart for my own good, Sakura-chan." "No pain. My arm's gone numb, I think. I can't heal this wound with the poison still in you. Plus your arm may need surgery if the fang caused the bone to shatter." "Then just put a bandage on me and I'll wait until I get back," Naruto said between pants. His increasingly weak breaths worried her. Sasuke watched as Naruto's eyes began to look distant and unfocused. "Naruto, stay awake," he said, shaking his good arm. Two very bad things could happen. If Naruto lost consciousness and Sasuke didn't want to witness either one. Naruto was putting up a valiant fight to stay awake, but his vision was swimming. He could only vaguely hear Sasuke speaking to him. And as the poison spread through his body he was becoming numb, so that Sasuke's tight grip on his arm went completely unnoticed. Soon his eyes closed and his body relaxed. "Naruto," Sasuke said. There was no response. "Sakura, we need to get him out of here," Sasuke said, making to scoop the limp man into his arms. "No, don't move him," Sakura said, placing a hand over Naruto's chest. It could move the poison faster through his bloodstream. Orochimaru stood atop his snake, his mouth curled into a victorious sneer. His hands flew in a flurry of seals. The snake venom would not affect the body once he had control over it. Sasuke and Sakura moved back slightly as Naruto's unconscious body suddenly arched up from the ground with a gasp as if he'd been kicked. Looking quickly over his shoulder at Orochimaru, Sasuke saw with a sinking heart that only Kabuto's unmoving body lay on the snake's head. Orochimaru's consciousness must have moved, he realized, looking back at Naruto, who was now still. Orochimaru looked around in confusion. He had never had this happen when he had entered a body before. He recognized where he was immediately. The streets of Konoha didn't look much different than when he had been a child. There was a feel to his surroundings, however, that told him he was not in the real Konoha. A young boy no older than 7 walked past him, a shock of wild bright yellow hair covering his head. He walked by an alley between 2 stores and suddenly someone spoke. The voice was deep and Orochimaru could hear the malice in it. "Hey, kid, come here," a stocky man said from the shadows. Thick black hair falling around his face. The young boy looked at him fearfully, backing away slowly. "Respect your elders, you little shit," the man hissed, grabbing him by the wrist and dragging him into the alley. The boy cried out in surprise and fear, but the villagers who heard him turned away, pretending not to. Orochimaru followed them into the alley, not having anywhere else to go. The man slapped Naruto across his young whiskered face, the force of the blow sending him sprawling to the ground. "Stop your screaming or I'll kill you." The boy quieted immediately. He stifled his cries as the man began to beat him, cursing him and spitting on him. Both Orochimaru and the man watched pitilessly as Naruto sobbed quietly on the ground. When the man began to unbutton his pants, Orochimaru raised an eyebrow. Now that was interesting. Things like that left deep emotional scars. Naruto had obviously kept up quite the facade when he had been younger. This information could be used to his advantage. Naruto began to scramble away, terrified. The man advanced steadily towards him. "Some skeletons are better left in the closet," a low voice said from behind him. Turning, Orochimaru came face to face with the adult Naruto. He was unmasked and staring calmly at Orochimaru. "Kyuubi killed his family," Naruto said, by way of explanation. Behind him Orochimaru could hear the young Naruto's screams. "How did it feel?" the dark-haired man asked, a malevolent grin spreading across his face. "The most painful thing I've ever experienced," Naruto said flatly. A wave of his hand, the screams were silenced and the memory was gone. They stood alone in darkness, only able to see one another. "You shouldn't be poking around in my memories." "Did no one come to investigate the screams?" Orochimaru asked, a small smile on his face. "Why should they have?" Naruto asked. "It was only the demon child. And still, you protect these people. Why?" Naruto didn't answer the question. But if it was because he didn't want or simply couldn't, Orochimaru didn't know. "Konoha doesn't recognize greatness in good, Naruto-kun. To show your true strength, you must force them to see it. Make them fear you and they will see you and your power. Together we could destroy those who refuse to acknowledge our power." Naruto gazed steadily at him. "You shouldn't be here, Orochimaru." Orochimaru noticed the sudden echo of Naruto's words. There was a noise of slowly dripping water that sounded loudly throughout the darkness. As his eyes adjusted to the dark, he realized he was in a large dark room made of stone. "Get out of here, Kit," a big voice said from the darkness. "I'm not your Kit, stop calling me that," Naruto snapped. There was a snort. "You have no power right now." Tendrils of red chakra were wrapping themselves around Naruto, slowly tightening. "Retreat back to your memories for now, I have things to discuss." Naruto's fists clenched at his sides as he was rendered motionless. "This is not your decision to make, bastard fox." The fox didn't answer and Naruto was suddenly tossed backward, disappearing into the blur of color that was his memories speeding by. The voice spoke, but Orochimaru could not find its source. "What are you doing?" it asked. "I want to take over Naruto's body," Orochimaru replied, unafraid. There was a sniff. "You smell of evil, much more refreshing than the Kit's scent. What do you want with his body?" "I want power. My power." It was not a question. "You'll have a much freer reign under my control. I don't mind letting you take over once in a while." There was a low rumble and it sounded as if the fox were laughing. "See, human, that is where you have misjudged me. I don't plan to be under anyone's control. Kit does not control me. He fights me with his entire being. For that he has gained my respect, despite my hatred of him. You are arrogant to assume you could control him, and even more arrogant still to think you could control me. You are powerful and evil, and perhaps together we could do much damage, but I've spent too many years with this brat. I have been slowly merging with him, weakening the seal as the years go on. I cannot allow you to come in after all this work and ruin it. When I am free, After destroying those important to the brat, you'll be my next target. If I could eat you now I would. But I'm not yet free to move around. Orochimaru finally saw where the voice was coming from as two glowing red eyes came into view, separated from him by a large set of vertical metal bars. The eyes flashed and Orochimaru felt a sharp jolt. When he opened his eyes he realized he was back in Kabuto's body, lying atop the snake. He angrily climbed to his feet, glaring at Naruto. The fox had not only rejected him. He had threatened to kill him. No matter, the poison would take care of them both anyway. Calling a retreat to his forces, he and the snake he stood on disappeared. Why waited with bated breath after Naruto had gone still. If he woke up and was Orochimaru they had to be prepared. After several moments there was a flare of red chakra that suddenly surrounded Naruto's body. Sasuke and Sakura backed away quickly. The flare of chakra was a familiar sight to Jiraiya, who had seen a similar occurrence with Sasuke 10 years before. Looking to Kabuto's body he saw it stand. He smiled. Naruto had fought him off. Sasuke could feel that Orochimaru was no longer inside Naruto, however he had no time to feel happy. Naruto's eyes had snapped open. They were blood red. Sakura, get back, he said, as Naruto began to stand. Sakura moved away quickly, recognizing the seriousness of her former teammate's voice, and even though his mask covered his expression, Sakura cool. Almost picture the grim set of his jaw as Naruto stood. The Akatsuki was gone, but Shikamaru realized instantly that the threat to their lives was not over. Hinata and Neji were watching with wide pupil-less eyes. The chakra was not normal. They could almost see the anger it radiated. There was such an abundance of it as well. Fighting Naruto, with their Byakugan it hadn't been difficult to discover who he was. Although their emotions at the discovery were another matter entirely, in this state it would be impossible to win, even with everyone working together. The older generation of Shin Obi stared in horror at the man who now radiated visible red chakra. They knew exactly who he was now. They had not felt that chakra for over 25 years, and with this man's apparent death 10 years ago they had believed themselves rid of it for good. Pulling down Naruto's mask, Kyuubi looked around at all the potential victims with a feral grin, elongated fangs gleaming. When the mask was removed and the whiskered cheeks shone, anyone who hadn't realized his identity was instantly informed. Kyuubi's red eyes fell on Sasuke and his grin grew wider. You shall be the first, he said, stalking towards the dark-haired Anbu. Naruto, Sasuke said, backing away. Fight it. Naruto's face twisted into a sneer. He's very tired. Not sleeping for 10 years will do that to you. Kyuubi crouched, lowering Naruto's center of gravity, preparing to leap at Sasuke. He suddenly stopped, dropping to his knees. What? He said angrily. A few yards away Shikamaru was on his knees as well, face howling immense strain as he struggled to hold his Kajimane no Jutsu on the powerful creature. Sasuke, snap him out of it. You're the only one who can, he said through gritted teeth and closed eyes. He didn't even notice Choji and Ino worriedly kneeling at his side. Sasuke moved quickly, dropping to his knees in front of Naruto and pulling his Anbu mask off. Several ninjas thought getting that lose to a demon was a stupid move, but no one dared try to get the Anbu to back away. Naruto, you have to fight him. Kyuubi snarled viciously. I'm not running away, and there's no way I can beat Kyuubi. So if you don't want me to die you'd better get control, Dobi. Sasuke said, repeating the words Naruto had yelled at him 10 years before. Shikamaru's jutsu broke and the young Junin collapsed, completely drained from his desperate effort. Ino and Choji caught him before he could fall face first into the ground. The ninjas of Konoha watched in horror as Kyuubi raised a clawed hand to slice through Sasuke, who made no attempt to dodge. Suddenly Kyuubi's eyes flashed and became purple. Sasuke remained where he was, keeping eye contact with the man in front of him. Naruto fell to all fours, his fingers digging into the earth and red chakra still swirling around him. Shino raised an eyebrow in understanding. He'd felt this chakra before. This was not the first time Naruto had had to battle with the fox. Suddenly the red chakra was sucked back into Naruto with such force that he was tossed backwards and slid several feet. Sasuke moved to his side, relieved to be looking down into blue eyes. That, Naruto panted, looking intently at the man he had almost clawed in half moments before. As a dangerous game, it's a game of trust, Sasuke said with a small smirk. Sorry, no. Reactions to Naruto's return in this chapter. The poor ninjas had much too much going on to be able to properly reflect or deal with the emotions his appearance will bring. So just like them, I pushed reactions to the back of their minds, to save for a time when I can give them the attention they deserve. Of decisions, Sasuke stood nearby as Sakura gently wrapped Naruto's arm. Blood began seeping through the white bandages as soon as she wrapped them, but there was nothing else to be done. Those who had known Naruto stood around anxiously, not too close, but not very far from him either. Ions and questions were flashing through their minds as they watched him lying on the ground, struggling for breath. It amazed them, now that the young man's mask was down, that they hadn't recognized him before. He looked almost the same but older. His face was more defined and the marks on his cheeks were somehow wider, but everything else remained the same, right down to the blue eyes and tan skin. The ninja who hadn't known Naruto, and therefore had hated or feared him, stayed at a distance from him, despite his weakened appearance. Those who weren't wounded helped other medical nins move the injured and dead. Naruto, you need to get back to Konoha as quickly as possible, Sakura told him when the arm was bandaged. Naruto's eyes were closed, but she knew he was awake. I don't have the ingredients to create an antidote. Blue eyes opened to peer thoughtfully at her. What happens if it's left untreated? Sakura looked down at him in confusion. You'll die, she said. Does it happen quickly? He asked between breaths. She didn't understand why he was asking such a question and looked at Sasuke in confusion. Did Naruto want to die? Sasuke saw her expression and made to move towards them, but Naruto raised his voice slightly, saying, "This is a conversation between my doctor and I, Sasuke." The dark-haired man froze, before crossing his arms and turning his head away with a humph. The rest of the friends looked on in confusion. Well, Sakura-chan, Naruto, I don't understand. Just answer me, Naruto said, with a serious tone she'd never heard from him before. Sakura studied him for a moment before complying. The snake venom has 3 phases. The first is what you are in, it causes paralysis. It is slowing down your heart and lungs, which is why you are having trouble breathing. To be honest, I don't know how you're still conscious. The snake usually eats its prey before this stage is over, but humans have discovered that if the venom remains in the system for more than a couple of hours, the poison begins to react to the blood, giving a person the sensation of being burnt from the inside. Shinobi often use it for torture. Naruto remained quiet, waiting for her to continue. This can continue for hours before the person dies. I'm sure Tsunade-sama will be able to make the antidote, so if we can just find a way to get you back quickly. I'd rather just stay here, Naruto said, closing his eyes again. But Naruto, Sakura said. Like hell you are, another voice said. Naruto didn't open his eyes. Sasuke, I told you to stay out of this. Sasuke I not have been close enough to hear the conversation, but another advantage the Sharingan gave him was it made it very easy to read lips. Sakura, Sasuke said, see if Jiraiya can get Gamabunta to give Naruto a ride back to Konoha. Naruto growled, opening his eyes to glare at Sasuke who was standing above him. This isn't your decision to make, Uchiha. The sentence lacked much force behind it though. For Naruto was still struggling for air. Sakura hesitated, but Sasuke glared at her and she quickly stood and went to Jiraiya, leaving the 2 men alone. What the fuck do you think you're doing, Dobi? Sasuke asked when she left. Nothing that should come as a surprise to you, Naruto wheezed. Sasuke kneeled next to him, placing his weight on his heels. I'm not going to let you use me as an excuse to kill yourself. I'm not using you as an excuse, I'm using the large snake bite in my arm. You only got bitten because you pushed me out of the way. Would you please drop the self-loathing thing? It's extremely annoying. This is my life, Sasuke. If I want to risk it by keeping you from being eaten, that's my decision. And if I'd rather stay here than rush back to Konoha on the chance that Tsunade can heal me, that's also my decision. Sasuke was quiet for a moment, listening to Naruto's unsteady breaths. Finally he spoke, and if our positions were reversed and I was the one opting to stay rather than go back? What would you do? Naruto sighed. Send you back kicking and screaming. They could hear Sakura returning. Gamabunta says he can get you back to Konoha in a few hours, she said, nervously awaiting Naruto's reaction. Well, since that freak of a frog is more stubborn than Sasuke, it looks like I don't have any choice in the matter, Naruto said in a cheerful manner that varied greatly from the serious tone he'd been using with Sasuke only moments before. Disrespectful brat, Gamabunta boomed, extending his tongue to gently pick him up. Sasuke, Naruto said, before it pulled him up. I'm sorry. Then he was whisked away and laid on the top of Gamabunta's head. Sorry for what? Sasuke thought in confusion. Was Naruto planning something? I'm coming with you, Jiraiya said, glaring up at the frog as if daring him to say no. Gamabunta was not the only one who cared for Naruto as a son. The frog nodded and Jiraiya leapt to his head. Sasuke took a step forward, considering going with them. Naruto's last words left him extremely uneasy. He paused, feeling a gentle hand on his shoulder. Turning his head he saw Kakashi standing behind him. Sasuke, he said, with a nod in the direction of Choji and Ino who were watching what was going on, but kneeling next to an unconscious Shikamaru. With Shikamaru recovering, we need you here. Sasuke hesitated, looking up at the frog, then back to the leaderless shinobi. Kakashi was right, he had a duty to the troops. Gamabunta set off at a high speed and soon he was out of sight. Sasuke watched them go, regretting his decision almost immediately. Tsunade may not have looked it, but she was getting too old for this. When Jiraiya arrived on Gamabunta, arriving Naruto in his arms, she had sprung into action. Doing her best to ignore the tightening in her chest, they carried Naruto to a hospital room. She'd lost too many people and grimly vowed Naruto would not be added to that list. The young man was obviously in severe pain. His eyes were clenched tightly and his teeth ground together in an attempt to keep himself from screaming. Tsunade was surprised he was able to remain conscious. As soon as Jiraiya explained what had happened, Tsunade recognized the snake venom. A lethal poison used mostly for torture. It would figure Orochimaru would have access to such a substance. The cure for it had only recently been discovered. And fortunately Tsunade had all the ingredients needed to make it. As she injected it into Naruto's arm, she couldn't help but think about how close she had come to having to announce his death. Again, another hour and there would have been nothing she could have done. Thinking about that now would do her no good, though. She glanced at Naruto, whose face was angled towards the right so he couldn't see what she was doing. He was extremely quiet and she could only assume he was focusing all of his energy on hiding any indication of being in pain. He had refused to allow her to give him any type of drug before she performed surgery on his wounded arm. He did not want to risk losing consciousness again. Tsunade could only imagine what it felt like to have her poking around in his arm with her metal instruments with nothing to dull the pain. She was impressed though. Naruto managed to remain absolutely still for her. He surprised her when he suddenly spoke. But he'd at least had the intelligence to wait until she had paused her work to ask Shizune for a different instrument. Will this take long to heal, Tsunade Baba? He asked, staring blankly at the white tile wall. The operating room was so boring. It had the dull sterile feel one expected from a hospital and it was doing nothing to distract him from what she was doing to his arm. Tsunade peered at him over her white surgeon's mask. For a normal person I'd say a month or so, but with your unique healing capabilities probably less than a week. She began probing into his arm again with what looked like a large pair of tweezers. Carefully, she searched for the tiny fragments of bone that had been shattered. I'm leaving after the surgery, Naruto said resolutely. He'd only stayed or the surgery because Tsunade had warned him that without it his arm would become useless. What? Tsunade said, her chocolate eyes looking up from his arm and at his face, which remained averted. Can't you at least wait a day? Give yourself a chance to start healing. No, I need to go as soon as possible, Naruto said firmly. Kyuubi was closer now, his presence buzzing constantly in his mind. An unpleasant reminder of why he'd left in the first place. He also knew he needed to leave before everyone returned. Assuming they remained at the village for the night and headed home this morning. He guessed that they wouldn't be back until the next day. When Gamabunta had brought him in yesterday, Tsunade had given him the antidote and refused to operate on his arm until the morning, to give him a chance to rest. Not that he actually slept, but it had given him a chance to think. Everyone knew now, and he did not have the desire nor the strength to handle the questions that would undoubtedly be thrown his way. Then of course there was his biggest problem. Sasuke. He knew, without a doubt, that the dark-haired Anbu would not let him leave easily. Naruto had known he was going to regret coming back. He was getting too close. How many times when he was a kid had he wished Sasuke would acknowledge him as a friend? And now it seemed as though Sasuke genuinely did. But there was a reason ninjas so rarely befriended one another. Too many dangers in such actions. Caring about others could be used by the enemy as a weakness. Orochimaru had done it. If he had sent the snake directly at Naruto, he would have dodged. But by sending him at Sasuke, he had ensured that Naruto would take the hit. Caring impairs judgment and distracts on a battlefield. Naruto had to distance himself from Sasuke for both their sakes. He had no particular attachment to his own life. He would gladly give it for Sasuke. He would not, however, allow himself to become Sasuke's weakness. Naruto had been spiraling out of control for years, and he would not let Sasuke throw away his life for a hopeless cause such as his own. The path Naruto walked held only one certainty that he could see: death. This was why he needed to be gone before Sasuke returned. Gone, and far enough that the Anbu couldn't pursue him. Because Sasuke wouldn't listen to reason, and Sasuke was the only one who could weaken his resolve. Shikamaru was tired. Not the normal tired that accompanied a long day, or the kind of tired he always seemed to feel whenever he had to deal with something troublesome. Shikamaru was weary, and, despite the fact he'd just now floated back to consciousness, he could feel exhaustion threatening to claim him already. As a man who went out of his way to ensure that he didn't exert himself unless absolutely necessary, the effort it required to open his eyes almost didn't seem worth it. However, even in his half-awake state he could sense the presence of many people. It took him several blinks to clear his vision and a few more moments to understand where he was. The feel of the soft mattress under him reminded him he was in his room in the hotel, and from there memories began to resurface. He'd used all of his chakra when holding the Kajimane no Jutsu on Kyuubi. The moment the shadow connected with Naruto, he felt the intense power trying to break free. It had knocked him to all fours immediately. After his jutsu broke, he'd blacked out, and he only vaguely remembered speaking to Choji and Ino somewhere between the battlefield and his room. They'd told him Naruto's condition and that he was already headed back to Konoha with Jiraiya. Is he going to be okay, Sakura? Shikamaru heard a female voice ask. Ino. Pink hair suddenly filled his vision as Sakura leaned over him, checking on him. He'll be fine. He just used up all of his chakra, she replied. Startled green eyes met tired brown ones. You're awake, Sakura said in surprise, looking down at him. Let me see, Ino said, and Sakura was suddenly pulled from his line of vision to be replaced with a scowling blonde. Shikamaru blinked. He knew that look, but he had no idea what he'd done to piss her off this time. Why didn't you tell us? She said. Shikamaru's normally quick mind sluggishly tried to understand her question but was coming up with nothing. Regretting the action the minute he took it, he pushed himself into a sitting position, raising an eyebrow when he saw how many people were crowded into his room. The original Rookie 9, except for Sasuke and Naruto, and Guy's old team was present. He wasn't quite sure how they had all managed to fit into his room. They were all looking at him, waiting for an answer to the question he didn't understand. Tell you what, he asked. Naruto, you knew he was alive and didn't tell us. Ino said angrily. I knew something weird was going on, Kiba muttered from the chair near Shikamaru's bed. Sakura had managed to heal his leg, but it would be sore for a few days. Akamaru barked at his feet. Why didn't you tell us, Shikamaru? Choji asked. He didn't seem as angry as Ino or some of the others. The poor man just looked confused and upset at the idea of his best friend hiding something from him. He asked me not to, Shikamaru answered truthfully. Why wouldn't he want us to know? Lee asked. I don't understand, Hinata said. She had never become any less soft-spoken. So when she talked, the group had learned to quiet down and listen, otherwise no one would hear what the young woman said. She looked tiny standing next to the tall figure of Shino. Why has he been pretending to be dead? They were looking to Shikamaru for answers he didn't have. You have to ask Naruto, he said. Don't give us that ask Naruto bullshit, Kiba snapped. Tell us what you know. Shikamaru could feel the exhaustion creeping through his body, and all he wanted to do was crawl under the blankets and sleep. That is all I know, he said. Why did everyone have to be so troublesome? He hasn't told me anything about where he's been or why he left. When I asked, he told me it was a long story, and Sasuke looked ready to throw a kunai into me for even mentioning it. The only thing I can tell you is to go ask Sasuke. At this, Kiba snorted, who may or may not know, or wait until we get back and ask Naruto. It seemed obvious that Shikamaru really didn't know any more that they did. He wouldn't deal with the trouble of saying so many words if he were lying. That is, of course, assuming he hasn't died, Sakura said, surprising them all. She was looking coolly at Shikamaru. You should have at least told me, she said. Don't you think that I had a right to know? Sakura, he said, it wasn't my decision, even if I had wanted to go against Naruto's wishes. Tsunade-sama forbid me to tell anyone. Sakura didn't appear mollified at his words, but she didn't say anything else. Tsunade, Kiba said. What is this, some huge conspiracy? Neji had been quietly standing near the door, his Anbu mask hanging from his hip. Shikamaru, what was that red chakra? Your use of your jutsu this morning indicates that you knew what was going on. Shikamaru sighed. Finally someone asks him a question that he can answer, and it was yet another thing the Hokage had ordered him to never talk about. I'm sorry, but I can't discuss it with you, he said. There was a murmur of discontent throughout the room. Definitely a conspiracy, Kiba said. The journey back to Konoha was very slow and very tense. What was usually a day's walk would probably take almost 2 since they were slowed by the injured. Shikamaru observed the returning group with a sigh. The group of 50 had been reduced to 30, almost half of which had been left injured. They had waited a day before setting out for Konoha, giving both the injured and the healthy a chance to rest before the long walk. After his inquisition, Shikamaru's friends had left, and he had taken advantage of the quiet. Sleeping through the day and waking refreshed this morning. His friends knew he knew more than he was telling, and because of this they were giving him the cold shoulder. At times during the wall, he could feel a glare or two directed towards him. They wanted answers, but he was not the one who could give them. Even if he hadn't been ordered not to speak of Kyuubi, he wouldn't have told them. It was Naruto's secret to divulge, no one else's. Besides, he had more important things to worry about than getting the silent treatment. Sasuke walked next to him, and for all the calm and poise he outwardly presented, Shikamaru could feel the tension rolling off him in waves. Sasuke was too busy brooding to pay any attention to Shikamaru. Gamabunta and Jiraiya had left mid-morning yesterday. If they didn't get to Konoha in time, or Tsunade didn't have the ingredients she needed, Naruto was probably already dead. And it would be his fault. Again, if he hadn't frozen up, he may have been able to dodge the snake. If he had at least tried, Naruto wouldn't have had to push him out of the way. Sasuke heaved a frustrated sigh. At this pace they were still almost a day's walk away from Konoha. Sasuke, Shikamaru said, casting a glance at him. You should go on ahead. The fox mask turned to him quickly. Tsunade-sama should be informed of the battle and prepared to treat our wounded, Shikamaru said. A hardly noticeable sly gleam in his eyes. He hadn't forgotten that Jiraiya was already at Konoha, and fully capable of informing Tsunade. Behind his mask Sasuke nearly grinned. Shikamaru W. as giving him an excuse to get back to Konoha as quickly as he could. Without another word Sasuke took off immediately. At full speed he could be back in Konoha in a few hours. The sun had set several hours before, and the soft light of the crescent moon shone gently over the group of shinobi. They had stopped earlier in a small clearing of forest that they could all comfortably sleep in. They were close to Konoha now, and those who often ventured from the village had begun to recognize their surroundings. Still, they were far enough away that Shikamaru had opted to allow them all to rest for the night. And the remaining few hours could be walked in the morning. Most of the shinobi were sleeping, save the few who were on guard duty. Kakashi sat high in a tree, leaning against the thick TR. Unken scanning the forest from his vantage point while absently twirling a kunai between his fingers. He wasn't officially on guard duty, but sleep would not come easily tonight. Naruto's sudden and secretive return was preying on his mind, as was his earlier struggle with the Kyuubi. He couldn't help but wonder if the two were related somehow. There were so many unanswered questions, and until He returned to Konoha there was no one to answer them. An angry presence suddenly entered his senses, but, for all the emotion it gave off, Kakashi could tell it held no harmful intent, so he calmly continued twirling his kunai. Sakura suddenly walked into his line of sight and would have looked like she was taking a normal walk if she wasn't moving sideways up the tree, gravity pulling her long hair towards the ground. Stepping onto the large tree branch he occupied, she took a seat. He kept up his usual nonchalance because he could tell it was comforting to the woman. So many things had changed so quickly that it was nice to know that some things remained constant. "Tell me you didn't know, Kakashi-sensei," Sakura said, staring down at the shinobi 50 feet below them. "About Naruto?" he asked. "No, Sakura, I had no idea. How is he still alive? Why didn't he tell us?" Her tone became angry. Why would he go to Sasuke? Sasuke almost killed him. Kakashi had always wondered if Sakura had kept her word. Tsunade had told him that in the heat of battle Sakura had told Orochimaru, whom she had thought was Sasuke, that she would never forgive him for Naruto's death. Afterward, everyone understood that it hadn't actually been Sasuke who killed Naruto, but they all recognized that Sasuke's decisions had ultimately led to the young man's death. Obviously, no matter how civil Sakura was to her former teammate, she had held to her vow. Kakashi didn't know how to answer her. He had no idea what had transpired between Naruto and Sasuke in their first and second fights. Maybe Sasuke simply found out like Shikamaru. Or maybe what Naruto really needed wasn't a friend, but a little friendly competition, he suggested. Sakura sighed, letting her dangling legs sway back and forth. "He'd better be all right," she said solemnly. Then, as if trying to lighten her own mood, she added, "because I'm going to give him an earful when we get back." She raised her fist and her eyes flashed. Kakashi's visible eye curved into a smile, pleased to see his former student more like her old self. Although, he'd feel bad for Naruto when she got to him. Something told him the younger man was in for quite a few lumps on the head. Some amazing artists have sent me fan art based on my story. The links are in my bio since Net refuses to let me put a link in here. Check them out, they are awesome. Of running, Tsunade and Jiraiya looked up in surprise when Sasuke burst through her office doors. He'd actually used the doors this time since the hole he'd made several days before was now boarded up. Tsunade was sitting behind her desk ignoring the stacks of paperwork littered across it, and Jiraiya was leaning comfortably in the chair in front of the desk. "Is he okay?" Sasuke asked the Sannin. Tsunade blinked at him before answering. "He's fine, Sasuke, but can I see him?" "Sasuke," Tsunade said, biting her bottom lip. "He's not here." "Where is he?" "In the hospital," Sasuke asked. "No, Sasuke, he left. He's not in Konoha." They couldn't see his face under his Anbu mask, but his suddenly rigid body told them that the news wasn't being well received. "When did he leave?" he asked in a low voice. "A couple of hours ago," Tsunade informed him. Sasuke turned, preparing to follow him. "Sasuke, he was with Gamabunta," Jiraiya told him. "You'll never catch them." Sass. Uke rounded on them, and Tsunade idly realized that even though the wooden mask's expression never changed, it was amazing how, when the wearer was angry, the fox face seemed somehow more menacing. "Why did you let him leave?" "I didn't want him to go either," she said. "But I can't force him to stay, especially now that we know Orochimaru cannot posses him." He wanted to go. Sasuke could feel his chest tightening as Naruto's departure really sunk in. He'd left again. He was gone. The consuming loneliness Sasuke had lived with all of his life, the loneliness that had slowly begun to abate with Naruto's sudden presence, suddenly hit him with a force that nearly took his breath away. There was a pop, and Sasuke looked at Tsunade's desk to see a large orange frog sitting comfortably on her paperwork. "Pop said to tell you that the kid's fine," he said to Jiraiya. Where is he? Sasuke asked, swiftly moving towards the desk. I've been forbidden to say, the frog said, his mouth curling into an amphibian's version of a grin. Sasuke roughly pulled his mask off, sending a piercing glare at him. The frog seemed unaffected. I'll talk to you later, pervert, he said with a wave. You've been spending too much time with that brat, Gamakichi, Jiraiya muttered, fondly remembering a time when all the frogs, except for Gamabunta, used to treat him with respect. Wait, Sasuke exclaimed as the frog prepared to go. He kneeled in front of Tsunade's desk so he was eye to eye with Gamakichi. The Sannin both stared at him, but he ignored them. Can you at least take him a message? Sasuke asked. Gamakichi studied him for a moment before nodding his consent. Tell him I thought that Uzumaki Naruto never ran away. He's just a coward who talks big, but doesn't follow through. Tsunade and Jiraiya exchanged glances. They had expected something more, well, sentimental, but this was Sasuke after all. With a nod of understanding, Gamakichi disappeared, leaving smoke hovering over Tsunade's desk. Sasuke stood, paying no attention to the Sannin and stalking towards the door. Pop. Followed by, yo, kid, announced Gamakichi's return. Sasuke turned and Gamakichi continued. He said, if protecting my friends means being a coward, I don't want to be brave. Tell him that sneaking off while no one is here is not protecting us. It's running away from us so you don't have to face anyone. There was a pop, followed by a silence as the three ninja awaited Naruto's answer. A pop. Then, no one will want me there anyway when the village finds out who I am. Sasuke was about to grow at the frog to tell Naruto to stop making stupid excuses when Tsunade spoke, surprising him, Jiraiya, and Gamakichi. I want you here. There was a pause and Jiraiya added, so do I. Gamakichi looked at Sasuke, as if asking whether or not he should deliver the messages. Sasuke raised his eyebrows and shrugged. The frog took this as a sign to go and disappeared. He returned a few minutes later. He said, thanks, Tsunade Baba. Arrow Sennin, but could you give us a second? The frog looked pointedly at the door and Jiraiya took the hint, standing and walking around the desk to grab Tsunade by the arm. The blonde woman did not seem pleased about being forced to vacate her own office, and she was probably even less pleased that she would be missing the rest of the conversation. When they gone and the door was shut, Gamakichi gave Sasuke the rest of the message. Sasuke, just forget about me, I need to stay isolated. Don't worry, I'm used to being alone. So am I, and I'm tired of it. Sasuke exclaimed, just tell me where you are. I hate it here by myself. We can be alone together. Pop, that's an oxymoron, moron. Shut up, Dobi. Pop, you shut up, asshole. What a response, Sasuke said with a snort. Get your ass back here so I can kick it. Pop, if I recall you were the one unconscious with broken bones after our last fight. I would have gone with you then if you had asked me to. Pop, Sasuke quickly sat down in Jiraiya's vacated chair, putting his head in his hands. Seconds turned into minutes and Sasuke began to fear that Naruto wasn't going to respond. Pop, not looking up, Sasuke didn't notice Gamakichi smile at him. It was not the grin he'd been wearing earlier, more of a sad little smile. He said, you don't see the danger you're trying to put yourself in. If you won't protect yourself from me, I'll have to do it for you. I'm sorry, Sasuke. Sasuke didn't move and Gamakichi continued. Sorry kid, but he told me not to wait for a response. With that Gamakichi disappeared, leaving Sasuke slumped in the chair. He'd only just said goodbye to Gamabunta and set off on his own 5 minutes before Gamakichi had appeared with Sasuke's message. It had been unexpected, to say the least, but fortunately, with Sasuke being so far away, Naruto had been able to keep his wits about him. In person, Sasuke might have been able to convince him to stay, or to let him come with him, but here he was safe. After sending Gamakichi off with a final message for Sasuke, Naruto began walking up the road, with no destination in mind except for away from Konoha. He was finally on his own again for the first time since he had traveled to Konoha. It was what he'd been wanting from the start. So why did he feel so miserable? Naruto ignored the feeling and veered to his left, disappearing into the forest that ran parallel to the road. The sun was setting and Naruto wanted to remain off of the main roads. He knew from years of experience of living on the road that after dark thieves and bandits prowled the roads for weary nighttime travelers to prey on. Normally it made no never mind since Naruto was perfectly capable of defending himself from common thieves. But Tsunade had warned him not to use his arm as much as possible until it healed. It was bandaged and pulled up in a sling that was draped loosely across his shoulder. It still throbbed painfully from the surgery and Naruto was more than happy to avoid any unnecessary fighting. As he walked through the forest the sun fully set, and the only dim light he saw to walk by now came from the crescent moon. Long shadows of the trees stretched across his self-made path as he picked his way around fallen logs and foliage. It was a cool night, an indication of the fall that was rapidly approaching. Naruto made a mental note to see about getting a jacket in the next town he visited. Short sleeves were fine for August, but even in the fire country winters could be brutal. Naruto had been traveling for a good while when the sounds of a battle reached his ears. It was some ways to his right, not in the direction he was heading at all. He paused in his walking, torn between checking it out or continuing on. He could barely use his arm, so seals and two-handed fighting was out of the question. He had almost decided to ignore the battle when a familiar chakra presence caught his attention. Kyuubi obviously felt it too and Naruto grit his teeth, forcing the fox's sudden surge of chakra back. "Stop advertising our presence, Baka," Naruto muttered to the fox. Chakra like that was bound to catch someone's attention, especially him. Naruto could feel the fox's sudden desire to go after him and even Naruto's curiosity was piqued. I suppose it couldn't hurt to take a look. Shikamaru had awoken with a start to the shouts of those on guard duty. Ambush. We're under attack. The Konoha ninja were awake and alert in moments, prepared to fight. Even most of the injured were ready. Ignoring their pain, Kakashi and Sakura dropped from above him, landing in crouches and armed with kunai. The three remaining Anbu stood in various positions around the clearing, each masked and their katana unsheathed. When the attack came it was from all sides. It only took a glance at the slashed forehead protectors of their enemies to realize that Orochimaru wanted to finish off the small remainder of their force. The battle began and Shikamaru couldn't help but notice the extremely low odds they had of surviving. They were wounded, outnumbered, and surrounded. Not to mention that three of their best shinobi were in Konoha. A Sannin, Anbu captain, and extremely powerful Kyuubi vessel would have definitely come in handy right at the moment. Sakura dodged he soared of her opponent and backed away to place some distance between them. Sakura was not a battle ninja. She was a medical ninja, and a damn good one at that. She was intelligent and had amazing chakra control. But these traits only went so far when a man was trying to skewer you with a katana. Leaping away from a swing of the sword that likely would have cleaved her in half, she pulled 4 shuriken from the pouch on her hip, tossing them at her attacker, who easily deflected the stars with his sword. He threw a kunai at her and in her haste to dodge she tripped, twisting her ankle painfully as she fell to the forest floor. Her attacker appeared above her, dark eyes glimmering in unspoken victory. Sakura immediately began gathering her healing chakra. If he struck her somplak, that wasn't instantly fatal, she could possibly heal herself. Possibly. He raised the sword and brought it down at her. Her eyes widened in surprise as a figure came between her and the sword wielder. Using a double-edged kunai to deflect the sword, the attacker stumbled and backed away, taking in his new opponent. He was obviously one of the wounded, for his left arm hung uselessly in a sling. The sword user smirked. It was noble of this guy to protect the woman, but it was stupid of him to try and fight with only one arm. He would take care of this fool quickly. Raising his katana he flew towards the man, prepared to make the final blow to his unguarded left side. There was only so much a man could do with one arm and a kunai. Bringing the katana around in a powerful swing, he could only stare in surprise when the man twisted slightly, crossing his right arm across his body and once again using the kunai to stop the blade's momentum. They stared at one another, locked in that position. The swordsman used the strength in both arms to try and force the edge of the blade into the other man while the other man managed to steadily hold the katana back with only his kunai. With only the tiniest flash of victory in his eyes, the sword user saw one of his comrades throw 2 kunai at his opponent's back. He increased the pressure of his sword on the kunai, keeping the man's attention on him. His dark eyes widened in surprise when the man sidestepped the kunai about to strike him and they flew by their original target, slamming into his chest. He fell to the ground, lifeless. Placing his kunai back into his pouch, Naruto turned to check on Sakura, who had used the opportunity to heal her ankle and was now gingerly standing. "You all right, Sakura-chan?" When she recognized him she could only gape in surprise. Naruto's hair remained covered, but his face was no longer masked and he stared at her with an expression of concern. She had had faith in Tsunade being able to heal him. But still seeing him standing in front of her was surreal. She had lived for the past 10 years with the understanding that he had died. It was as if she was in a dream. She snapped herself out of her daze. "I'm fine. How did you get back here?" Naruto shrugged with a grin that seemed so familiar, yet so out of place on his face. "Long story." Sakura eyed his bandaged arm. "Should you be fighting with your arm hurt?" she asked. "No," he answered, glancing around. His eyes settled on something he didn't particularly like the looks of. "Be careful, Sakura, I've got to go take care of this." And just like that he was gone. The problem with Shikamaru's shadow jutsu was that using it in the middle of battle with many enemies left him wide open for other attacks. Unfortunately he'd had no choice in the matter. He had been identified as the leader, and 12 Akatsuki had decided to come at him at once. Shikamaru was the first one to admit he was not good at fighting sheer numbers. Naruto, now he was a man for numbers. So were Sasuke, Tenten, Lee, and many of the others. He, however, was much better with one-on-one combat, and if he couldn't do that he'd at least need time to think about a way to defeat a dozen men at once. Now, of course, he had the problem of holding 12 men in his jutsu while attempting to dodge any attacks from behind. Not to mention he still wasn't exactly sure what to do once the jutsu broke. Which would be any time now. A kunai was tossed at his back just as several shuriken came whizzing at him from his right and he realized dodging both attacks was not going to be an option. He sidestepped the kunai, and, had anyone had a chance to watch they would have seen the humor in the situation as the 12 men under his jutsu all moved to the side in unison. Growling as their bodies refused to listen to them. He braced himself for the hit of the shuriken but only heard the dings of metal on metal as someone stood next to him, blocking each one with a kunai. "Don't think I'm letting you die and get off the hook for keeping secrets from me, Shikamaru," Ino said when the shuriken had all fallen to the ground. Shikamaru looked at her, smirking. "Are you talking to me now?" She raised an elegant eyebrow. "I don't know what you're talking about." Shikamaru's smile fell suddenly as he began to feel the familiar strain of holding his jutsu. "Hope you're ready to fight 12 unhappy guys," he said tightly. "You're kidding," Ino said, blonde ponytail flipping over her shoulder as she turned her head quickly to observe the men he was holding. Ino's strength at fighting large numbers was not much better than Shikamaru's since using her specialty jutsu left her even more defenseless than Shikamaru's. "I wish," Shikamaru said as his shadow suddenly retracted back to him. The men remained still for a moment, surprised at their sudden ability to move. Then as realization came over them they grinned, moving towards the two and quickly surrounding them. Shikamaru and Ino stood back to back, both holding a double-bladed kunai in each hand. The men rushed at them, several at a time. Shikamaru and Ino tried to remain back to back to avoid being split up but the men quickly managed to separate them, for continuing to attack Ino, while Shikamaru was surrounded by 8 enemies of his own. Shikamaru didn't have the chakra left to try and use Kajimane no Jutsu again. Not when he needed to stop that many people. One of the several men managed to connect a punch to his face and he stumbled backwards into another one, a giant muscled man. Hikamaru's head barely came up to his chest. He grabbed Shikamaru's arms, twisting them behind him and forcing him to drop his kunai. He felt the air in his lungs leave him as one of his attackers used his incapacitation to throw a heavy punch to his stomach. When Shikamaru looked up again there was a man in front of him, a kunai raised. He struggled, but the grip on him only tightened and with his arms behind his back he couldn't do any seals. Ino had managed to kill one of the 4 men she was fighting, but the other 3 were relentlessly attacking. With a kick to the abdomen she managed to knock one of the men away from her for a moment, giving her a chance to check on Shikamaru. He was surrounded by at least 8 men, a large one holding him steady as he struggled to break free. A shinobi stood in front of him, ready to stab him with a kunai. He was going to die, she realized in horror. He was going to die, and she had wasted her last day with him being angry over something that he had had no control over. Shikamaru, she cried, but as she attempted to help him, one of her attackers blocked her way and she was forced to block several jabs of his kunai. Shikamaru heard Ino's scream but was unable to see her through the circle of people around him. He struggled harder, but stopped as the man in front of him slashed down with his kunai, aiming for his heart. There was a grunt of pain and a lifeless body dropped to the ground. Shikamaru looked up in surprise to see Naruto had leapt above the circle of men, throwing a kunai into his would-be killer's back before landing in the center. Naruto sternly regarded the men around him. 8-on-1 isn't exactly fair, now is it? He said. The man holding onto Shikamaru spoke. How about 6-on-1? Then, his deep voice asked, nodding to his comrades who began to close in on Naruto. Naruto pulled a kunai from the pouch on his hip, dropping into a fighting stance. The burly man laughed. Your friend is rather foolish, no? He asked Shikamaru. Taking on 6 men with only 1 arm, he can't even use seals like that. Shikamaru didn't say anything, but he had to agree. Although, after the conversation in Sasuke's kitchen, he wasn't overly surprised at Naruto trying to take on more than he could handle. He just hoped he wouldn't be the witness to Naruto's actual death. The men came at Naruto quickly, and they were amazed at the speed he was able to use to dodge the continuous slashes they made with their weapons. When one of their number cried out and fell to the ground, they paused in surprise, watching as Naruto Iftly pulled his kunai from the man's chest, ignoring the blood that splattered across his face. 5 to go, he said, flipping the kunai around in his hand for a better grip. Cocky, aren't you? One of the ninjas said. He had a slashed hidden mist hitai tied loosely around his neck and a long scar ran down his cheek. There's a difference between cocky and confident, Naruto said, meeting his gaze. And you should be neither in this situation, the mist ninja said, raising his hands to form a seal. 4 water clones appeared next to him, upping the number of enemies from 5 to 9. This would have been no problem if he could use the Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, however, that was slightly out of the question. They came at him again and Naruto found himself under a pile of men and clones. Kakashi could see that something was going on in the center of the clearing. He had heard Ino cry out to Shikamaru earlier and he could only hope that neither one of them was wounded or worse. Fortunately had no way of getting to them to help. He was fighting 5 enemy shinobi who were all skilled at taijutsu, which was the one thing that the Sharingan had trouble with. Wishing he could switch off with Guy, who would have a much easier time with this than he was, he managed to send a kunai with an exploding tag into a nearby tree where one of the shinobi he was fighting was lying in wait. He nearly groaned when 2 more ninjas took their comrade's place, actually raising the number of enemies he was fighting to 6. Near him were Neji and Tenten in their Anbu gear and masks, slicing anyone who attempted to attack them. On the other side of the clearing, Kiba had to leap out of the way as Choji barreled by him. The other man was nearly double his normal size and was rolling so quickly the next thing he came into contact with was going to be flattened. Akamaru barked at the rolling man. Watch where you're going, Choji. Kiba hollered. Sorry, Kiba, was the response. Choji had managed to take out his 2 opponents, Kiba realized, and using the momentary break he bent down to rub his still sore thigh, which had begun to painfully throb with all the exertion. Akamaru whined at him, knowing he was hurt. Kiba was about to pet him in reassurance when a handful of shuriken came flying at his head. He ducked and rolled away, struggling to his feet as the throwing stars embedded themselves into the tree that had been behind him. Akamaru was at his side in an instant. Kiba took stock of his opponent. He had only just thrown the shuriken and he had 3 more between the fingers of his right hand. And 2 kunai in his left. Noticing all the weapons pouches the man had along his pant legs, Kiba realized that this was a man who favored taijutsu and weapons, the type of person Kiba didn't really have the ability to deal with at the moment. His leg throbbed again, reminding him of his hindered speed. With a grin the weapons user threw the shuriken at him, then let the kunai fly at Akamaru. Who was too busy watching the shuriken to even notice? Akamaru, Kiba said, scooping up the dog and placing his back to the kunai. There was no way he could dodge them. His leg was nearly ready to give out on him completely. When no hit came he turned, only to see Hinata standing between him and the weapon's user, having caught the two kunai. Are you okay, Kiba-kun? She asked softly, her pale eyes narrowed at the weapon's user. Yeah, I'm fine, he said, looking beyond her to the man who had attacked Akamaru. Now he was pissed. Setting the dog down, he too, limping step to stand next to Hinata. The weapon's user just grinned, reaching into the pouches and pulling out several kunai, shuriken, and a few long daggers. You can only dodge so much, he said. Unless nothing gets thrown, a low voice said from behind him. He turned his head quickly to see a man standing behind him, a long white coat covered by a Junin vest and his hands stuffed into his pockets. The weapon's user snorted as he took in his sunglasses-covered eyes. It was almost midnight. The man probably could barely see anything at all. He raised a two kunai to finish this man off. First when he noticed in the moonlight that several black dots were moving along his weapons. Then suddenly there were more, crawling out from underneath his sleeves. What is this? He yelled, trying to flick off what he now realized were small black bugs. It's not worth it to explain, Shino said, walking past him as more bugs appeared on him and walking over to Kiba and Hinata. His two former teammates were used to seeing this kind of thing and ignored the man as he screamed and frantically tried to remove the growing number of bugs, running off into the forest. Shino, Kiba growled, I was going to kill him. Not on that leg, Shino said impassively. Kiba was ready to angrily respond, Shino was ready to quietly ignore him, and Hinata was ready to shyly try and interject, a scene the three had played out many times over the years, but a loud yell of Guy-sensei got all of their attention. Guy and Lee were taking on nearly 20 men, and the three shinobi were about to go help. When they realized neither man needed it, the yell they had heard was actually Lee calling out in awe, tears of joy streaming down his face as Guy twisted and kicked three men several feet into the air, all the while laughing his booming laugh. See Lee-kun, he said loudly, you do not have to be young to have great strength. Guy-sensei, Lee cried, knocking two men out with fists over his shoulders. Not bothering to turn and look at his opponents. You are truly the greatest shinobi in Konoha. Even though you are so old. Lee-kun, I am glad you think so. Kiba, Shino, and Hinata exchange glances as the two green-clad men continued sending their opponents flying away. I know I can be loud, but at least I'm not a moron, Kiba said, shaking his head. Who lied and told you that? Shino asked, turning to go back to battle. You son of a. Kiba-kun, please calm down. And everything was normal with the former teammate. When Shikamaru saw Naruto disappear under the large group of men he tried again to get away from the man who held him, but the grip on his wrists only tightened and he realized that if he moved any further he was going to break his wrist. Naruto felt himself hit the ground, painfully landing on his left side. White-hot pain shot up his already wounded arm at the contact. He rolled to his back as a kunai slashed towards his head, landing in the dirt next to him. This was no way to fight. Ignoring the pain in his left arm he clenched the fist on his right, feeling the familiar tingle of chakra beginning. He hadn't planned to use this technique on a bunch of ninjas that normally wouldn't be worth his time, but he now had no choice. This was the only technique that he could do with no seals in one hand, even if it had taken him years of practice to get it that way. The ninjas on top of him looked down in confusion as a blue light began to fill their vision. All they heard before they were blasted away was Rasengan. They were dead before they made contact with the ground. Shikamaru, his captor, and anyone in the area stared at Naruto in shock as he struggled to his feet, his right hand smoking. When the ninjas of Konoha quickly returned their attention to their battles, their opponents were gone. They all looked around in confusion, tightly holding their weapons, prepared for a trap. A sharp breeze had begun to blow. Kakashi knelt down where his two opponents had last stood, tracing his fingers through the sand on the ground. Naruto ignored the sudden disappearance of enemies. His narrowed blue eyes met the wide-eyed gaze of the man who had Shikamaru. Going to let him go now? He asked. The burly man snorted, twisting Shikamaru's arm so sharply that the brown-haired man grimaced in pain and fell to his knees to reduce some of the pressure that was on it. With one swift movement the man had pulled out a kunai and had it pressed against Shikamaru's exposed neck. "Shikamaru!" Ino cried, now free to see what was going on. The remaining two men she was fighting had disappeared. "Come near me and I'll kill him," the man said, pushing the dagger closer to Shikamaru's throat to prove he was serious. "You're surrounded," Naruto said. "How far do you think you'll get if you kill our leader and comrade?" "My allies will keep you all busy," he said. "What allies?" Naruto asked, gesturing around the clearing, which held only Konoha ninjas and dead bodies. Where did they go?" he stuttered, beginning to panic. "Looks like they deserted you," Naruto said with a malicious grin. Those who could see his face shivered. That was not the type of expression they had ever seen on Naruto when he was a boy. "Well," the man said with sudden grim determination, "if I'm going to die, I'm going to take as much of you Konoha bastards with me as I can." "No," Ino, Choji, and several others from the Rookie Nine called, all of them moving forward in a futile attempt to stop him from slashing Shikamaru's throat. "What?" the man said in shock, trying to move his arm, but finding himself unable. Looking down he saw what looked like sand wrapped around his entire arm, not allowing him to move. The sand flowed far off into the woods, its end not visible to those who stood in the clearing. It began to pull his arm, slowly moving the kunai away from Shikamaru's neck. Then it suddenly jerked the man with a quick movement, kicking him up into the air and dangling him there by his arm. The Konoha ninjas watched in amazement as the sand then pulled him into the forest. There was a scream, then nothing. Ino ran to Shikamaru, throwing her arms around his neck and hugging him tightly. The pony-tailed man blinked at her in confusion before slowly hugging her back. Several of the friends exchanged grins at the scene in Bega. To slowly move towards the center of the clearing. Naruto remained where he was, only moving once, holding his uninjured arm in the air in a silent warning for everyone to stay where they were. They all listened, standing still. "Uzumaki Naruto," a low voice called out from the deep shadows of the forest where the sand had taken the man. A figure slowly emerged from the shadows, coming into full view of those in the clearing. They looked towards the trees and those who had taken the Chunin exam together immediately recognized the speaker. They remained where they were, although nothing but grim determination kept Sakura from backing away a few steps. She had seen only half of what this man could do when he was 12 and the thought of him growing more powerful made her stomach flip. Hikamaru and those in from the former Team 8 also felt a growing dread inside them, having had the misfortune of seeing the man in action once before. A short man stood across from Naruto, his arms crossed over his chest. Ninja garb hung loosely on his gangly body and on his back was a large tan gourd, the cap obviously not on it as sand poured gently from its opening. Dark shadows surrounded. His light blue eyes and his blood-red hair stood out in stark contrast to his pale skin. On his forehead was the symbol for love in a deep red color that matched his hair. "Gaara of the Sand," Naruto returned calmly. Two figures stood behind Gaara, nearly hidden by the shadows, but Naruto didn't need to see them to know who they were. "Temari," Naruto said with a nod to the figure on Gaara's right, Kankuro, to the left. The Konoha ninjas remained still. The Sand siblings were allies of Konoha, however, they were also very dangerous, Gaara in particular. All of the Rookie Nine, several Junin, including Kakashi and Guy. And Guy's former team had heard about Naruto's fight with Gaara. No one but Sasuke and Kakashi knew the details of what had happened. All they knew was that somehow Naruto had defeated Gaara. From the scowl on his face it seemed that Gaara still held a small grudge. The Konoha ninjas watched in muted horror as the red-haired man stretched out an arm. Sand that was previously lying unnoticed on the ground leapt up at his command, taking the shape of a hand. With an unspoken command the sand rushed at Naruto, who didn't move from his position. "He's going to get killed," Hiba said, and Hinata's hands flew to her mouth. They knew what would happen if the hand wrapped around Naruto. The next thing they would see of him would be goo all over the forest. Naruto didn't even blink as the hand of sand rushed by him at a speed that rustled his clothing. It flew to a tree behind Naruto where an Akatsuki ninja was hiding, poised to throw a kunai at Naruto's back. "Gaara!" closed his hand into a fist, and the Konoha ninjas flinched at the strangled cry and sound of crushing bones. Gaara's arm then returned to cross casually over his chest as the sand began slowly creeping back into his gourd. "What do I always tell you about watching your back, Naruto?" Gaara said. Most of the people in the clearing watched wide-eyed as the red-haired man allowed a tiny smirk to cross his features. Naruto grinned. "What's the point when you can do it for me with so little effort?" Naruto broke eye contact with the other man, glancing down at his arm for the first time since he'd started fighting. It was bleeding profusely. A red stain was slowly getting larger on the sling, making it obvious that he was hurt. The wound had reopened when he'd been slammed to the ground, and sharp pain was now shooting up his arm. He had refused to let Kyuubi even give him chakra in this fight because he knew that the presence of Shukaku drove the fox insane. Even now he could feel him struggling to take control, if only long enough to get near Shukaku's carrier. Naruto knew for a fact that Gaara was feeling the same pull within him. The demons were attracted to each other's immense power. They could feel the other's presence even when they were far away, which was how Gaara had known Naruto had not died. He had run into the Sand siblings several times throughout the 10 years he'd spent wandering. Temari and Kankuro enjoyed his presence. He was like a little brother they could tease without worrying about being killed for it. And although it was only the slightest difference, barely even noticeable except to his siblings, Gaara became protective of him. He understood what it was like to have something inside you constantly trying to get free. They had a strange connection. Naruto had stayed with them for a few months, not long after he'd left Konoha. It was when Naruto and Gaara realized that the demons were beginning to try harder to break free of their human prison that Naruto had decided to go. The feel of the other's power so close began to make both demons crazy. They wanted out, and they wanted the other's power to add to their own, and they took every opportunity to try for it. Gaara and Naruto knew they had to distance themselves, so Naruto had left. Whenever they ran into one another, the demons acted up, so they kept meetings as brief as possible. Naruto began to feel drained as he struggled with Kyuubi. Naruto had used a good bit of chakra during the fight, and as he kept Kyuubi back, he found that remaining standing was no longer an option. His knees buckled, and he would have fallen ungracefully on his ass if a chair of sand hadn't suddenly appeared under him. Naruto looked at Gaara, who was watching him impassively. Realizing that there was no threat of a bloody battle between Naruto and Gaara, the Konoha ninjas began to relax. After Ino had removed herself from his neck, blushing in embarrassment, Shikamaru began to take a mental tally of their losses. More of them were injured, but somehow they were all still alive. He doubted the outcome would have been the same if Naruto and the Sand siblings hadn't shown up. He knew for certain that he'd have been dead anyway. But what were they doing here? Especially Naruto. He had just gone to Konoha the day before. The medical nins quickly went to work, moving through the clearing and giving help to those who needed it. Gaara made his way to the center of the clearing, nodding to Naruto in greeting. Temari and Kankuro followed him, and when Shikamaru saw the bits of blood on their clothy, he began to get an inkling of where their enemies had suddenly disappeared to. Several of Naruto's friends watched in complete surprise as Gaara stood next to Naruto, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder as the other man sat tiredly in the sand chair. It looked as though the normally frightening and emotionless Gaara was actually trying to comfort Naruto. Onlookers didn't realize that the close proximity managed to calm the two demons, and Naruto was able to relax slightly as Kyuubi became a bit more content to feel power that close and gave up on his frantic struggle for the moment. Shikamaru ignored his surprise and began walking towards them, Ino hot on his heels. It seemed she had no plans to let him out of her sight any time in the near future. He didn't particularly mind, for she was quiet and allowed him to think. He needed to figure out what was going on. The Sand ninjas were not scheduled to be anywhere near Konoha as far as he knew, and Naruto's presence was especially surprising. More so because he was without Sasuke or Jiraiya. Sakura followed Shikamaru. She could see that Naruto had once again hurt his arm, and she needed to ensure he hadn't done any further damage. Kakashi trailed behind the three younger ninjas, hoping to get some answers for once. Also, the silver-haired Junin simply did not trust Gaara, especially not after Pakun had explained the fight Naruto had had with him in detail. When the four ninja neared the group around Naruto, they could hear him complaining. Could you have waited any longer to join the fight? He asked, looking up at Gaara, who was staring impassively at the tree above the other man's head. I know you were there. We were doing little things here and there, Kankuro said with a shrug. Well, isn't that nice, Naruto muttered. I'm getting dogpiled by 9 guys and you 3 were doing little things here and there. Oh, stop complaining, you get more immature every time we see you. Besides 4 of those guys were clones, Temari said. Leaning lazily on her tall metal fan, Naruto humphed and looked away from her with a pout, but Shikamaru noticed the small upward tilt of his lips and the little smile on the fan user's face. They acted so familiar, Shikamaru realized, as if they were friends. Now that he thought about it, none of them seemed surprised to see him alive. Had they known, what are you doing here? They heard Naruto ask. Last time I saw you was near your village. Gaara felt your most recent battle, and we decided to see if you had died, Temari said with an air of teasing. Looks like we got our hopes up for nothing. Naruto snorted. Sorry to disappoint you. Kankuro shrugged. There's always next time. Naruto shook his head good-naturedly. Gaara turned his head to watch Shikamaru, Ino, Sakura, and Kakashi approach. Gaara of the Sand, Shikamaru said, nodding to him, and then his 2 siblings. Temari, Kankuro. Sakura moved over to Naruto's left side, leaning down to get a good look at his arm. She was surprised when another chair of sand appeared next to Naruto's, giving her a way to sit levelly with him. She looked up at Gaara wide-eyed, but the man hadn't removed his gaze from Shikamaru or Kakashi. She also noticed he hadn't relinquished his grip on Naruto's right shoulder either. Go ahead, Naruto said, inclining his head towards the seat. He had noticed her hesitancy. It's just like a chair. Sakura sat down tentatively, then carefully removed his arm from the sling and began to unwrap his bandages. Naruto turned his attention to the conversation next to him. Tsunade-sama would like to thank you, I'm sure, Shikamaru was saying. Kankuro spoke up. Sorry, Konoha isn't on our way. Shikamaru sighed. I don't want to beg, but you saw what almost happened here tonight. Many of us are injured and the rest of us have been up all night. If we are attacked again, there is no way we'll be able to survive. We could really use your protection. Kankuro and Temari exchanged glances before turning back to look at Gaara. When it came down to it, he was the one who called the shots. They would do what he said. Especially in this situation. He knew the dang R of keeping Kyuubi and Sukaku close for too long. It's only half a day's walk from here, Shikamaru said. Please. Sakura called Naruto's attention to her. You need to go back to Tsunade, she said quietly. I honestly can't believe she let you leave so quickly. The wound has reopened and it appears that the contact with the ground has refractured the bone. This rapid blood loss leads me to believe the bone may have punctured an artery. Can't you just heal it? Naruto asked. He couldn't go back to Konoha now. No, Naruto, this isn't the type of wound that can just be healed with chakra. It might need surgery again. And if I don't get treatment, you could lose your arm, she told him seriously. Naruto managed to remain impassive as Gaara's hand on his shoulder tightened painfully. We will go to Konoha, the red-haired man said. He was looking at his siblings, but Naruto knew that he included in that order. I didn't plan on having the Sand siblings in this at all, and then they decided that if they weren't invited they were going to crash. Ah, well, and to the several of you who have informed me of their love, I love you too, in a purely platonic never met you kind of way. Thanks for reviewing. Of Control, Naruto could feel the eyes on his back as he walked. He and Gaara walked at the very front of the group, as close as possible to one another to keep the demons relaxed. Fortunately, having Gaara at his side also kept the others from confronting him with the questions he knew they all had, particularly Kakashi and Sakura. Temari and Kankuro were at the back of the group, ready to go if any attacks came from behind. You don't want to go back? Gaara asked suddenly, surprising Naruto. No, why? I'm afraid I won't be able to leave again, Naruto told him. They won't let you? Gaara asked. I don't know, Naruto answered, wondering what Sasuke would do when he discovered he was back. Then I will stay and make sure they do not stop you, Gaara said. Naruto looked at him in surprise. Gaara, you don't have to do that. Gaara didn't answer. The gates of Konoha eventually came into view and the ninjas in the group never felt so happy to see their small village. Several Anbu came out to meet them, already expecting their arrival. Medical nins also came out, instantly helping the injured to the hospital. Temari and Kankuro moved to the front of the group, Temari taking the position next to Naruto while Kankuro stood next to Gaara. Ninjas of the Sand, one of the Anbu said in surprise. We were not informed that you were to visit. He turned to one of his masked comrades. Go find the captain, he said. Naruto closed his eyes. He knew there would be no way to avoid Sasuke, but he didn't want to see him as he stood flanked by the Sand siblings. Covered in blood that was mostly his own, trying to ignore the fox, who desperately wanted to take over now that he had a friend. That won't be necessary, Shikamaru said, stepping forward. They helped us when we were ambushed and I asked them to accompany us here in case we were attacked again. The Anbu nodded and Naruto relaxed when he saw that no one was going to get Sasuke. Sakura walked up to them. Naruto, you should get to Tsunade. Sama, she said, noticing that blood had begun to seep through the clean bandages she had wrapped around his arm a few hours before. Naruto nodded and headed towards the village. Everyone watched as Gaara followed, not removing himself from his side. Temari and Kankuro exchanged glances. They had thought they were going to leave once they made it to Konoha. They trailed after Naruto and their brother, wondering what had changed. Sasuke knew someone was behind him, but he didn't turn. He was too focused on venting his frustration on the tree in front of him. Bits of bark went flying as his leg continuously kicked at the trunk, and his knuckles were bleeding from punching the rough surface of the tree. It wasn't enough, Sasuke realized. He wanted to break the tree, to hear it splinter and crack as it fell over. Gripping his left wrist with his right hand, he summoned up a massive amount of chakra to his palm. He rushed at the tree, shoving his fist through it and watching with a self-satisfied smirk as it leaned precariously before finally falling with a loud crash. And yet, as he stood panting over the broken tree, he didn't feel any better. Finally the man behind him spoke. Sasuke, I know trees tend to be difficult and tricky opponents, but I'm not sure you needed to use Chidori on it, Kakashi said, peering at the Ounger man over the latest edition of Come Come Paradise. What do you want, Kakashi? Sasuke said, wiping the sweat from his brow as he turned to look at him. You didn't come greet us when we got back, Kakashi said. I've been training. Quote, Kakashi grew serious and closed his book, placing it in his pocket. What happened during the battle the other day? He asked. Kyuubi surfaced. Why, I don't know, Sasuke said, wanting anything but to talk about Naruto. Does it have something to do with why Naruto pretended to be dead? Kakashi persisted. I don't know, Sasuke said, beginning to get angry. He wasn't talking about this. He spent the last 3 hours training and destroying trees on the training grounds so he wouldn't think about Naruto leaving. He didn't need Kakashi bringing him up again. He pushed past his old sensei and began to head home. Ask Naruto if you want to know, Sasuke sneered, knowing full well that Kakashi wouldn't be able to. Sasuke nearly tripped over his own feet at Kakashi's next words. I would, but between Tsunade and Gaara he's never alone. Sasuke turned around so fast that Kakashi had to wonder if he'd given himself whiplash. What? As soon as we got back, Tsunade ushered him into surgery, and Gaara has been in his room ever since. He's here, Sasuke said. Yeah, it's weird though. Naruto seems to really trust him, but they almost killed each other when they were 12. Kakashi said. Sasuke blinked in confusion before he understood what Kakashi was talking about. No, not Gaara, Naruto. Naruto is in Konoha. It was Kakashi's turn to look confused. Yes, he came back with us earlier. Sasuke didn't even say goodbye, turning and taking off towards the hospital. When Sasuke reached the hospital he quickly found Naruto's room number. He purposely strode down the white hallway, not really sure what he would say when he got there. Lost in thought, he almost didn't hear the voice say his name. Uchiha Sasuke. Standing across the hall from Naruto's door were Temari and Kankuro, the latter of which had called out to him. Kankuro was leaning against the wall with his arms folded. The white sack-like object that he normally carried on his back was propped up next to him. Temari's tall metal fan was next to her and she was leaning comfortably on it. They were glaring at him, and he stared back evenly. "I'm surprised you're here," Temari said. "Why is that?" Sasuke asked, not really in the mood for this, but humoring them. "Well, we heard you tried to kill Naruto a couple of times. Why bother checking on his welfare now?"